Nice to see you. Thank you. The hearing will come to order, and welcome. And I think the committee is privileged to see our distinguished chairman, Ed Royce, joining us, the chairman of the full committee, and I thank him for his leadership on Africa, having once served as chairman of this subcommittee. So great to see you, Ed, and thank you for your ongoing leadership and for yesterday's important briefing with Nikki Haley, our ambassador to the United Nations, and a major portion of that important briefing late in the afternoon was on the DR Congo. So thank you, Chairman Royce. The Democratic Republic of Congo was supposed to conduct elections 1 year ago this month in order to achieve the required transition of political power by December 19th. However, after years of stalling on making preparations for elections, the government of the DRC failed to hold elections last year and relied on a constitutional provision that President Joseph Kabila could not step down until an election was held to select a replacement. Both Chairman Royce and I and others, Karen Bass, our ranking member, have had ongoing meetings with DRC officials, including high-level people who have flown here to Washington, and time again we have admonished them, stick to the schedule and hold these elections and ensure that they're free and fair. The interpretation by President Joseph Kabila of the Constitution is an apparent contradiction to other constitutional provisions requiring elections to be held on time and limiting President Kabila to 2 terms. The Election Commission has just announced that elections cannot be held until sometime in late 2018. We were told by Ambassador Nikki Haley they're talking about December of 2018, and how often have we seen those timelines slip? And then we would be in 2019, and I think she made it very clear in yesterday's briefing that there are an abundance of sanctions, almost like a sort of Damocles, that would hold over the heads of those who, again, would push to delay, and I think that's very real, and I hope is very compelling pressure to ensure that they do exactly what they say they would do, because this is what the people of the DR Congo want. They want a free and fair election, and they want to choose their next leader. Polling has indicated that the majority of Congolese want Kabila's government to end and be replaced by a transitional government until a new one can be elected. We don't take sides, but we do want free and fair, and we want to make sure that the people's will prevails. Enduring conflict hotspots in eastern DRC have seen recent flare-ups, and I would note parenthetically, back in 2005, I traveled to Goma along with my good friend and Chief of Staff, Greg Simpkins, and we saw on the ground and met many of the people who had been raped, many of the women who had been so horrifically sexually abused, but we also, like with Africa Compassion, an organization that did wonderful work with helping to heal and to mitigate the damages of such abuse, saw that there were people on the ground, indigenous Congolese, who cared so much that they were going the extra mile to make sure that the fighting stopped and also that there would be a way forward for those who have been abused. In 2 of the regions, Kasai and Tanganyika province, the conflicts in Kasai and Tanganyika alone have caused the displacement of nearly 2 million people since mid-2016. And this is in a country where a war that seemed to never end took the lives of some 4 million people. You know, we all focus, as we should, on Darfur and the loss of life there. The number of people who have lost their lives in DR Congo historically eclipses that, which is a terrible, terrible legacy. The DRC has one of the highest rates of human displacement in the world. Political unrest in urban centers, a string of large prison breaks and violent attacks in Kinshasa, the capital, by members of a religious sect that has declared itself in opposition to Kabila have further contributed to the worsening security. The conflict in Kasai, which reportedly was first sparked in 2016 by the murder of a traditional leader by state security forces, had become a catastrophic humanitarian crisis featuring severe atrocities and a widespread recruitment and abuse of children. Meanwhile, the ongoing conflict in eastern DRC at one time saw violent activity by 2 million militia groups and an out-of-control national army, resulting in the systematic rape of about 50 women and girls per hour. This hearing is intended to look at possible solutions to a political stalemate that could very well lead to further violence and upheaval in a large African country bordering on 9 neighbors. It follows a successful resolution on DRC that I introduced and was passed by the House last year, and new legislation Ranking Member Bass and I are introducing very soon. We understand that there is no easy solutions to the current crisis in DRC. A negotiated transition likely could be achieved if President Kabila were convinced that neither he nor his family would be prosecuted for human rights violations or corruption. However, that would reward them for abusing their citizens and plundering the country's resources, and that is even if members of his government were not covered. A palace coup might take place in Kabila. This is not unknown in the DRC. Kabila's father, Laurent, was assassinated in office in 2001. Mobutu Seko, who is the elder Kabila, had himself overthrown an elected government in 1965. He was chased from power and fled into exile in 1997. However, a coup would not support international efforts to instill democratic practices in the DRC and could lead to protracted infighting and national chaos. We want an orderly, peaceful transition, and that's what the international community, led by the United States, is asking and really demanding. The status quo, as detailed earlier, is already leading to growing violence and will not lead to a peaceful solution the longer that transition is delayed. In fact, it is more likely that violence could escalate and spill over into neighboring countries, as did conflict in 96, I should say, to 97, and 98 to 2003. Over the past year, we have heard many, many promises by the government of the DRC about when the elections would be held. There have been several dates given for when voter registration would be completed during this past year. The current government timetable calls for voter registration to extend to the point at which elections couldn't be held in the DRC until late 2018, with an inauguration early in 2019. That would mean that Joseph Kabila would have an extra half-term in office when the Constitution precluded him from going past December of 2016. Consequently, we will today hear from the State Department on our government's diplomatic efforts to resolve the transition stalemate, and the U.S. Agency for International Development on our government's programs on the ground to promote democracy and free and fair elections. Our second panel consists of scholars and activists who will give us their informed insights as to how we can break this political stalemate and prevent more bloodshed in the DRC. Again, no solution will be easy or without cost, but non-action would even have a higher cost in terms of human lives, and that we must not tolerate. I'd like to yield to my distinguished friend and colleague. Okay. Go to Chairman.
Well, I'll defer first to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Thank you for your leadership for holding this hearing today, and I want to thank and welcome our distinguished witnesses today. You know, what is so tragic is that we all know that DRC is potentially one of the richest countries on earth. We know that it has an abundance of deposits of copper, gold, diamonds, cobalt, and many other minerals. We know that the Congo River is the second largest river in the world and the most powerful river in Africa, which means that the country has enormous potential to generate hydroelectric power, and some scientists say that it could provide enough power for all of sub-Saharan electricity needs. Now, on the other side of this, we know the stark reality of living in DRC today. We know that it's one of the poorest countries in the world, ranking 176 out of 187 on the latest UN Human Development Index. More than half of the country lives in extreme poverty, and we know that there's 3.8 million internally displaced persons, and we also know that there are parts of the DRC that are on the brink of hunger and famine. We shouldn't forget that in March of this year, all of the humanitarian efforts, we had 2 UN investigators of American and Swedish nationality and their Congolese interpreter were found dead. They were there to investigate alleged large-scale violence and alleged human rights violations by the Congolese army and local militia groups. So we know with the world's most complex humanitarian crisis, the DRC has 7.3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. But aid workers are finding it increasingly difficult to address the deteriorating situation in the DRC, and many face the risk of attacks and are unable to access areas in most need of humanitarian assistance. So the signs coming out of the DRC are not encouraging. The Congolese government and the main opposition coalition reached a political agreement to organize a vote by the end of 2013, and Kabila committed to not run for a third term. However, yesterday, we met, as the chairman mentioned, we met with our UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, who said that the DRC has announced that they will hold presidential elections in December of 2018. That seems like a ridiculously long time to wait, considering the elections were supposed to be held long ago. And I think, as you mentioned in your comments, that's just a way of really extending it into another term. But my concern is that even if it is genuine that there will be elections held in December of 2018, I'm not convinced that that does not mean that Kabila won't be on the ballot until we hear definitively a public announcement that he will not seek a third term and will not change the Constitution. And I believe, if I heard the ambassador right, Mr. Chair, she did say that he said he wouldn't change the Constitution, correct? That's right. But I do not believe he has made the public statement that he will not be on the ballot, which obviously, if he was on the ballot, that's a violation of the Constitution. However, we all know that sometimes people find ways of saying they're not violating the Constitution, like in Burundi. It was just a different interpretation. And the world will not tolerate that. I was encouraged by the ambassador yesterday, making very strong statements that the United States will not be there in support of the country unless we do see a commitment for a peaceful transition. And with that, I yield to the other chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I want to thank you, and I want to thank Ranking Member Karen Bass for the focus that both of you have kept on the DRC and for the trips that both of you have taken to the DRC, the resolutions that the two of you have passed, the effort to sort of galvanize our attention on this tragedy, a tragedy like no other, as you mentioned when you talked about the millions and millions have lost their lives there. And a lot of it is a governance issue with respect to a lack of rule of law, and that emanates, unfortunately, from Laurent and then Joseph Kabila. I also want to thank Greg here, Greg Simpkins, for back in 1997, we were, Tom Sheehy and I and a delegation from this committee were in neighboring Angola, meeting with Savimbi and Dos Santos, with our ambassador, trying to broker peace there. And you know, that night, the government of Mobutu was overthrown, and when we were there, and Greg was our interpreter, luckily, and we were able to take a plane into the airport in Kinshasa, and we met with the new government that was one day new, and he was able to also communicate with Tshisekedi, who was being pushed aside. We didn't find out all until a little later. We were able to track and follow Laurent Kabila, met with him in Harare in order to discuss this issue, the rule of law, the Constitution, the importance of elections. And we have struggled under the Kabilas. Now, I think we've made 3 trips. I have with Mr. Sheehy to Kinshasa, and we've met numerous times here or in New York. You know, I have to give Ambassador Haley credit for not just the commitment she got in terms of the December 23rd election next year, but also the benchmarks that are to be put in place and the announcement on the part of Joseph Kabila that there will be that election. Now it falls on us and the international community. So this is really good news. We finally have an election calendar. And I think we've got to welcome not only the announcement, but the sense among the people in Congo when you see them in civil society asserting their rights to be part of this process, because they've felt the consequences more than anyone. And so I think that the State Department, the administration, and us on the committee, we've got to monitor this progress, and if deemed insufficient, we must use every tool we have to pressure the government in Congo. Now is the time. If we do not address the political instability, then the violence and the unrest across that country, which has cost over 4 million lives so far, is only going to escalate. And as we watch people flee, and recently we've seen another 1 million try to escape the violence, when we see the 2 million that are displaced on our trips there living in camps, we know that the humanitarian situation is dire and warrants our immediate attention and the world's immediate attention, and we really encourage the NGO communities, some of who are here today, because too many Congolese are suffering. So we look forward to the witnesses' testimony today, and again, Chairman Smith, I thank you for this hearing.
Chairman Rice, thank you very much again for your longstanding, decades-long leadership. Really appreciate it. Dan Donovan, gentleman from Staten Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And since I'm not a chairman or a ranking member, and I learned so much more by listening than speaking. I just learned how long Greg has been here by listening to the chairman. I'm going to yield my time so that Secretary Yamamoto and Administrator Anderson can have more time to testify. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now introduce our first panel, two very distinguished public servants and leaders, beginning with Ambassador Donald Yamamoto, who serves as Acting Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs in the U.S. Department of State. He has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs from 2003 to 2006, and where he was responsible for coordinating U.S. policy towards 20 countries in East and Central Africa. Ambassador Yamamoto was also our ambassador to the Republic of Djibouti from 2000 to 2003, as well as to Ethiopia. He was the Deputy Director of East African Affairs from 1998 to 2000. And without objection, your full resume and that of our distinguished other witness, Cheryl Anderson, will be made part of the record. And Ms. Anderson is working as the Acting Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of African Affairs for USAID, the Agency for International Development. Ms. Anderson has more than 20 years of development experience, mostly in Africa. Since joining USAID as a Foreign Service Officer, she has worked in USAID missions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Sudan, and East Africa. Prior to joining USAID, Ms. Anderson worked as a program manager at HealthLink Worldwide and also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana. She has also testified before our subcommittee, so both of you, welcome back, and we look forward to your insights and recommendations. The floor is yours, Ambassador Yamamoto.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I ask for the longer version to be submitted to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And thank you very much, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass and Chairman Royce. Thank you very much for this very important hearing today. Today's hearing comes at a critical juncture for the DRC, and the country faces two starkly different possible trajectories over the next 12 months. Will we have presidential elections on December 2018 and the DRC's first peaceful democratic transfer of power? Or alternatively, will we see the absence of genuinely free and fair elections and a continuation of the current political impasse? We could see the DRC return to widespread violence and instability. Our immediate focus is to support the stability of the DRC through genuine, free, and fair elections that are credible and inclusive and lead to a peaceful democratic transfer of power. With the November 5th announcement of the DRC's Electoral Commission by the CENI, the elections will be held in December 2018. We have an opportunity to support the Congolese people achieve historic democratic transfer of power. However, this will require political will on behalf of the government of the DRC, organize credible elections, commitment by the oppositions to participate through the democratic process, and continued engagement, pressure, and support from the international community, including the United States. Ambassador Haley's October visit to the DRC sent a very clear, powerful message to President Kabila and his government that further delays and an unrealistic electoral calendar would be unacceptable. Ambassador Haley also told opposition party leaders that the United States does not support calls for unconstitutional change and stressed the need for all actors to work within the framework of the DRC Constitution and the December 2016 St. Sylvester Agreement. The administration is building on the momentum provided by Ambassador Haley's visit in the light of the CENI's recent announced electoral calendar to push all parties in the DRC to advance the electoral process. There is much at risk due to the DRC's vast size, population, and strategic location, including 9 international borders. Continued delays by the government in holding elections has increased tensions, undermine already weak, or in some regions of the country, non-existent state authority, and risked increased violence, unrest, and instability. The administration's focus now is on ensuring that the CENI and the government of the DRC implement the calendar and do not undertake any actions that further postpone the long overdue elections. We believe there is an opportunity for progress despite the challenges. A democratic transition of power, which can only come through genuine, free, and fair election, is essential for the Congolese people, the African sub-region, and the U.S. strategic interests across the continent, including preventing wide-scale regional insecurity and stability, which have been precursors to multi-state wars and genocide, denying illegal armed groups, criminal networks, and international actors and regimes, such as North Korea and ISIS, access to black markets to which trade in minerals and other natural resources, preventing the region from becoming a stateless zone that is impossible to monitor and respond to disease outbreaks such as Ebola pandemics, and preventing the recruitment and use of child soldiers and of atrocities such as the rape of women and girls as a weapon of war. While elections alone will not solve DRC's daunting challenges, they are critical to the country's stability. We are prepared to work with our international partners to ensure that the electoral process is transparent, conducted in accordance with international standards. It is important to understand this extremely complex country, the DRC, the size of the United States east of the Mississippi, with more than 80 million people and almost no basic infrastructure. All nationally elected politicians, not just President Kabila, have now overstayed their elected terms in office. Opposition parties and civil society are understandably deeply distrustful of the CENI's and the government's commitment to elections. Restrictions on freedom of assembly, as well as politically motivated prosecution of opposition leaders, have significantly exacerbated tensions. Already weak and limited state authorities has become increasingly tenuous and even absent in many areas, and some elements of the state security forces have committed human rights violations and abuses and mass atrocities. Numerous non-state armed groups also continue to operate in the DRC. The DRC is one of the world's poorest countries, despite having enormous natural resources and wealth. Despite the complex environment, we know that genuinely free and fair elections can be held in 2018, and there is no question that the Congolese people deeply desire to choose a new leader through elections. The Africa Bureau, the State Department, is working with our interagency partners to ensure concrete steps are implemented towards elections that are genuinely free, fair, credible, timely, and inclusive, and result in a peaceful democratic transfer of power. We are similarly coordinating closely with our international partners in regional states and multilateral institutions. Key elements of this approach include the announcement of the electoral calendar of December 2018. We are coordinating closely with our international partners to actively press the CENI, the DRC government, to fully implement all required steps in the DRC's electoral process. Second, we are actively pressing both the government and the opposition to operate within the framework of the Constitution and the December Agreement to reject violence and calls for unconstitutional change. Third, we are actively pressed both through public statements and private diplomatic engagements, the government of the DRC to respect political freedom and rights and refrain from excessive and unlawful use of force. Next, we coordinate our messaging and advocacy with key partners, including our European and regional partners. And finally, since June 2016, we have imposed targeted sanctions on 6 current and former DRC government officials. We remain prepared to impose additional targeted sanctions as developments warrant. While our immediate focus is on the electoral process, the DRC's urgent and ongoing security and humanitarian needs also remain important priorities. Together with our international partners, the United States has striven to end the violence throughout the DRC, including specifically in the Kasai and the East. We are continuing to provide assistance in response to the humanitarian crisis and to ensure that the Those responsible for abuses and atrocities are held accountable. We have worked with international partners to address the humanitarian needs of 3.8 million internally displaced persons, over 620,000 Congolese refugees now living outside their country, and nearly 543,000 refugees from neighboring countries who are inside the DRC. We will continue to engage with the DRC government, the UN, our international partners in finding a long-term solution to bring about peace and stability. In conclusion, the stability of the DRC is a key administrative objective in Africa, and given the DRC's significant economic, geopolitical, and security-related importance, we need only recall the ramifications of the last DRC war from 1998 to 2002. We understand the enormous transformational and transnational negative impact of armed conflict and political crises in the Congo. And through free, fair, credible, inclusive elections leading to a peaceful democratic transfer of power are essential to the DRC and the region's long-term stability and development. There remains many challenges and risks to achieve these goals, but our engagement and commitment are unwavering. And thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Ms. Anderson.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, Congressman Donovan. Thank you for inviting me to speak today about the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's always an honor to have an opportunity to discuss our work with supporters of Africa. And for me, it's a pleasure to be back testifying before this subcommittee. USAID has maintained a long-term relationship with the DRC and its people since the country became independent in 1960. With its vast mineral wealth, the country has tremendous opportunity for economic growth that could lift citizens out of poverty and propel the country into middle-income status. Instead, protracted political uncertainty is fueling violence and instability and prevents the realization of the country's full potential. The reality is that the DRC is teetering on the brink of a crisis such as it has not seen since the formal end of the Second Congo War in 2003. Due to the political crisis and continued electoral delays, the mandates of all elected DRC government officials have officially expired. While an election alone will not solve the DRC's many challenges, credible, inclusive presidential and legislative elections are critical to ensuring a peaceful transition of power, reducing the risk of widespread violence, and strengthening the country's democratic institutions and economic development. We're pleased with the recent release of an electoral calendar, but voter registration, already months behind schedule, must be completed. Revised electoral laws have to be passed, and funding has to be appropriated by the DRC government to cover the cost of organizing national elections. Finally, the government of the DRC needs to take immediate steps to allow civil society, journalists, and citizens to express themselves, protect the human rights of its citizens, and ensure that all political parties are afforded equitable access to the media and that their rights to assemble peacefully are respected. Alongside other U.S. government agencies, USAID remains committed to supporting the timely organization of peaceful, credible, and inclusive elections that reflect the will of the Congolese people. We have provided approximately $37 million in election and political processes programming since 2013. This includes 5 components: support for domestic election observation, civic and voter education, targeted technical assistance to the Electoral Commission, CENI, political party strengthening, and electoral justice. USAID's election observation activity is implemented by the local Episcopal Justice and Peace Organization. This is the leading Congolese election observation organization. We are helping to build their capacity to train and deploy long and short-term domestic election observers in accordance with international standards. The Civic and Voter Education Program is helping more than 35 different Congolese civil society organizations to inform citizens, and particularly women, youth, and other traditionally marginalized groups about the electoral process, their rights and role as voters, and the importance of peaceful participation in the elections. A grant to the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, provides technical assistance to the Electoral Commission, CENI, for operations, logistics, and effective use of information technology. USAID's Political Party Strengthening Program provides training to 10 political parties, 5 from the ruling majority and 5 from the opposition, to better represent and respond to citizens' concerns and improve the internal management and organization of the parties. Finally, our human rights and electoral justice activity strengthens the capacity of national-level justice actors, the courts and civil society organizations, to conduct legal education, provide legal services, and monitor and respond to human rights violations, including electoral disputes. The stakes for the DRC and for its neighbors could not be higher. Again, we are encouraged by the announcement of an electoral calendar, but we'll now need to see confidence-building measures to ensure that this timeline is respected and implemented, and all measures are taken for free, credible, and peaceful elections. This includes an end to politically motivated prosecutions, the release of political prisoners, and respect for the right of peaceful assembly and association, so that opposition parties and civil society organizations may hold peaceful public meetings without government interference or intimidation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, members of the subcommittee. I look forward to hearing your counsel and responding to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Anderson. To begin the questioning, I just want to make clear, especially for the C-SPAN audience that is following, somebody might say, why are we doing this? Why do we care whether or not a president follows his own constitution and whether or not he, having given commitments and being bound by that constitution to 2 terms, why are we so concerned about it? And I think the seemingly esoteric concern about rule of law, which is important, is eclipsed by the potential for horrific conflict, loss of life, that we're already seeing shaping up. We know when these elections and when people from various parties or even tribes, as is with the Nuer and the Dinka in South Sudan, that the flare-ups are huge, large numbers of people are slaughtered, and women are raped and horribly abused as a result. So we are on the cusp of what could be, as you have pointed out in your testimonies, an incredible new flare-up of violence in a region, as you pointed out, Ms. Anderson, that's the size of Western Europe, with 100 million people approximately, a large country where the potential loss of life is very real. So my questions first beginning with, again, the violence in the Kasai region. The number of internally displaced Congolese has surged to more than 3.8 million. While the number of suffering from acute food insecurity has reached 7.7 million. The UN has declared a level 3 humanitarian emergency in the DRC, putting it on par with crises in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how we're trying to mitigate this terrible humanitarian crisis that is festering before our lives, our eyes. Secondly, let me ask you if you could, with regards to peacekeeping, I'm the one who, as you might know, am the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, our landmark law to combat sex and labor trafficking and subsequent laws as well. It is a passion of mine, it's a passion of this committee to stop all trafficking because it is modern-day slavery. As we all know, the peacekeepers who were deployed to DR Congo early on had particularly during Ambassador Swing's tenure in office, had a terrible record of bribing or taking gifts from young people, raping 13-year-olds. These are the peacekeepers from the UN. We held several hearings on this subcommittee. Greg and I traveled to Goma and met with the peacekeepers there and have raised it at the United Nations here in Washington and in country unceasingly. We understand that, and I've been tracking this, that the efforts are far better than they've ever been, but certainly not there yet. People who do commit crimes against Congolese, particularly women and girls, are not only sent back to their home countries, but there's a heavy admonishment by the UN to prosecute, put them behind bars, and to ensure that they're never redeployed to another peacekeeping mission ever again where they can recommit those crimes. If you could speak, if you would, to MONUSCO, whether or not it's, practicing what we thought, Kofi Annan had called it, the zero tolerance policy. I had one hearing where we said zero tolerance policy in DR Congo, zero compliance, because it was so ineffectively being implemented, notwithstanding the great efforts by Jane Hall-Lute, an American who was in a key position there to fight for that. So if you could speak to that. And finally, let me ask you about the most credible, in my opinion, and reliable and effective interlocutors for peace, reconciliation, and free and fair elections, especially in the DR Congo, is the Catholic Church. Karen Bass and I were in South Sudan last May, and we met with Salva Kiir, the president, and had a very straightforward conversation with him. Not all that happy because of the terrible killings that are occurring there. He wouldn't even meet with the faith-based consortium of leaders, bishops, clergy of all kinds, who really are the key to reconciliation. And now we see potentially a deja vu of that in DR Congo. How do we support the church in its efforts and all those who are trying to have free and fair elections? The amount of money, who is it going to, if you would? And as Nikki Haley said yesterday, if this roadmap for having this election does not happen, we won't support the election. We're not going to support a fraud and a sham. So if you could speak to those three.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That's a long list of issues that we need to tackle. First is going to MONUSCO and peacekeeping operation. As you know, 63% of all UN ops is in Africa. And what we have been firmly committed, and especially with this new UN Security Secretary General, but also our own commitment to human rights, and also to your legislation, Mr. Chairman, which has been supportive and very helpful, is that we look at MONUSCO and all UN operations, that they have taken the necessary and proper steps on SEA, the sexual exploitation, and ensure that those who have committed those violations are held accountable. We've not done just not only MONUSCO, but in MINUSMA and all the other organizations. The missions conduct and disciplinary team in MONUSCO is currently composed of 23 personnel with offices in Kinshasa and 4 regional offices. And MONUSCO is implementing strong preventive actions in training, et cetera, through risk assessment, military police deterrent patrols, enforcement of strict curfews, and out-of-bound regimes. And the SRSG, again, has taken a very strong and tough position on the SEA. The other issue, too, is, as you know, the United States and the State Department, we train peacekeeping troops, about over 300,000. Part of that is human rights, protection of human rights, and the protection of SEA. Let me go into the other areas is on the violence, is that MONUSCO's main object and goal is to protect civilians. And of course, we have had from 2013, an intervention brigade, which is used to target groups like M23 and prevent other problems and militias from rising, and creating issues. And so those are some helpful uses. But the other issue, too, is that we need to keep up a very consistent, persistent observation of the gross human rights abuses taking place in the DRC, not only just by militias and the FARC troops, but by all groups. And we have to hold each person accountable. As you may recall, Mr. Chairman, that in June at the Human Rights Council, we supported the international experts being sent to Kasai to look at the gross human rights atrocities. And of course, but not only looking at the atrocities, but also investigating the cases, particularly the death of Sharp and Catalan. That remains, this murder case will remain a priority for us to look at and to investigate. The other thing is, during Ambassador Haley's visit to the DRC, she met with Senko and also the Catholic Church and also faith-based groups, and really strongly supported, and we agreed in strongly supporting the facilitation that the Catholic Church had arranged in the St. Sylvester Agreement of 2016. And as you know, faith-based groups have been a cornerstone, a pillar for a lot of our operations, not just in DRC, but throughout Ethiopia, East Africa, West, et cetera, because of their commitment and quality of work and low overhead cost. And I guess let me turn to my
And on the
colleague
peacekeeping, you did touch on that somewhat, but are we,
yes, on the
satisfied that they're protecting and the duty to protect is being followed and that?
The issue for the peacekeeping is not. I mean, let's be very clear, it's not. But the issue is the complexity of the DRC. By having a political impasse, it has emboldened a lot of the militias to conduct and engage in very striking, gross human rights abuse. And one way to kind of rein in some of this abuse is to have a coherent, free, fair, open, and elections that are going to be executed and implemented in 2018. We have to hold those people accountable. And let me just kind of, if I can go off one tangent on 3 issues, and that is that there are 3 requirements that we're going to be focused on. That's the technical aspects requirements. The other thing is the political requirements, and also the human rights requirements. And so the technical, obviously, is the electoral process, the announcing and registering voters, ensuring that they're scrubbed, looking at the voter registration, looking at the candidates' registrations. That's on a technical side. But on the political side is that what we're looking at very carefully is that the government, as well as the opposition, but the government has to have confidence-building measures. In other words, they cannot arrest political prisoners. They have to have open political space. They have to have allow assembly of people to assemble and to discuss. And there has to be looking at and curbing at and addressing the excessive use of violence and force. So those are some of the issues. And that goes into the human rights issues of looking at and trying to prevent and stop the excessive and gross human rights abuse. But let's go on to the...
Thank you.
Chairman Smith, you asked about the situation in the Kasais and then peacekeeping and then the churches. I'd like to start with the situation in the Kasai provinces. First of all, the widespread violence and human rights violations that we've seen there are totally unacceptable. This is against innocent civilians. We know that the violence has been subsiding, but that should not take our attention away from the fact that this is a very serious security and human rights and humanitarian situation in the Kasais with people starting to come back. We also have to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that people need to be accountable for the abuses that we've seen. So the United States, along with our bilateral and multilateral partners, have been responding with our efforts to end the violence and hold people responsible for the heinous acts, but also on the humanitarian side, we have been responding. We scaled up our funding. It has been hard to operate. It had been previously hard to even get in there. As you mentioned, it can be very treacherous for humanitarian workers, but we did scale up our response for health and food security. as well as protection of children who were affected by the violence. And we airlifted 300 metric tons of blankets and cooking kits and other kinds of humanitarian supplies into the area in Kasai Central, Kasai Oriental, and two other provinces there. In the whole country, this is just one part of the country, so there are different numbers out there. The ones that I have are that we have as many as 3.9 million internally displaced people in DRC, and that's the most, that's the highest number for all of sub-Saharan Africa. And 600,000 refugees who've now left the DRC. We have provided in fiscal year 2017, the U.S. government has provided a total of $190 million in humanitarian assistance across the country, and of that, $128 million is from USAID. And we always remain committed to providing humanitarian assistance to people who are in need, working with the UN and with our NGO partners. I won't really speak on peacekeeping, except to say that in the area of gender-based violence, I think you're aware that USAID has been very engaged since 2002 in preventing and responding to gender-based violence. And on the Catholic Church and churches and faith-based organizations, definitely these groups play such a critical role in the country in keeping peace and helping to ensure that people hold their government accountable, that they're involved in the election process, and also in providing services across the country to people. We have repeatedly endorsed the Catholic Church's December 31st agreement, and we continue to urge respect for that agreement. And I did mention earlier that we're working with the Episcopal Justice and Peace Organization on elections, domestic election observation efforts.
Thank you. Without objection, we're going to put the December 31st agreement into the record so all can see. Thank you for your testimony. I now yield to Ranking Member Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few questions. Wanted to get some specifics, because when you are talking about both of our witnesses, when you're talking about holding people accountable, I wanted to know how we do that. Ambassador Yamamoto, you were referring to, I think you talked about political, technical, you were talking about the confidence building measures. You said technical, political, and human rights? Is that what you were saying? So I wanted to know, how we specifically go about that. I mean, I hear from people all the time of folks being arrested, and I don't know what our role in that is, or when we see the violence taking place, especially government-initiated violence.
Let me give kind of one introductory remark and then go into the discussion. So since coming in as the Acting Assistant Secretary, I made a concerted effort to talk to all our partners and colleagues dealing with the DRC. And the issue is that we find it extremely unacceptable that the elections in the DRC has taken so long, and the instability that has given rise to militias and other groups because they've been emboldened by the lack of political certainty. So we've talked to the African Union, the SADC, and our European colleagues, the donors, and the issue comes in is that by holding Kabila and the opposition accountable, but mostly in this case, President Kabila, that he doesn't have political space to maneuver, to escape, to delay, but that he is held focused, that you will have elections. The other issue, too, is I know we discussed with the opposition, one of the areas was that they want to look at a transitional government. We said no. Under the Constitution and under the St. Sylvester Agreement, that Kabila will be there until the new president is selected. That means we will hold Kabila responsible and accountable to instituting, implementing the agreements, and according to the Constitution, the process for election of the president.
Yeah, I just wonder what we specifically do. I mean, I understand we talk to the AU, we talk to SADC, but what, you know, what measures do we specifically take? Is there something we withhold back? Is there, what do we do?
I think on a broader scope, by having our Africans and the Europeans committed and focused, that puts on President Kabila the onus that he has no political space. He has to implement. He has to be committed to doing this, and that there is no alternative or no ability to delay that process.
So, well, yes, although he has delayed it. So you mentioned also that there were sanctions that were prepared, and I was wondering what kind of sanctions. And then you know that we're looking at legislation, and I wanted to know what your thoughts were about that.
Everything has to be on the table, and as you know, we did implement targeted sanctions, OFAC sanctions, on 6 specific individuals, and sanctions are on the table.
And so if we target the specific individuals, what are we sanctioning them for? They can't come to the United States?
And their assets.
Do they have assets here?
Assets not only here, but in other countries. By doing on the banking institutions, that helps restrict their operations. It's something similar that we've done in other countries and to other individuals. I know that we have so that's on the OFAC side. The other issue, too, is we can look at limiting their ability to come to the United States through visa processes. We can also look through with the United Nations on UN sanctions, and also build on it through sanctions from the European Union as well. So it has to be a very concerted effort.
When we do sanctions like that on the individuals, because I know that some of these folks, I don't know specifically about the group you're talking about, but some of them have children here going to our universities.
Yes.
Do our sanctions ever refer to that?
The sanction is only on the specific individuals.
It's not like on a family per se?
Obviously, if for instance, I mean, hypothetical, if an individual's banking, because they have gotten ill-gotten assets, let's say the Kleptocracy Act, then that obviously will affect the family members because they can't access the banking institutions and to get the money out because those are ill-gotten assets.
Do we ever say their families can't come here?
It depends on if they have been targeted.
Yeah, I understood the financial part, but I was just, because I know that one of the strategies that's used is that their relatives are not in the countries.
Right, and
when all of the strife is happening, their individual families are protected.
Yeah, and you raise a very good point, Congresswoman Bass, and that's something that we're discussing separately. But the issue comes in is family members in one country where family members are living outside the country benefiting from ill-gotten assets.
Right.
Those people as well
right.
cannot access not only the banking facilities, but also any of the benefits from those assets. So because, they too will be under those things.
Because one thing that we do is that we allow folks to come here and buy real estate and all sorts of things. They're living well.
Mm-hmm. And again, the way we do the targeted sanction, it has to be very negotiated, it has to be looked at. We can't go into who we're considering for sanctions, but just generally that everything is on the table for discussion and the breadth and the depth of those sanctions.
Now, on our end, do we have an ambassador?
Currently, we have not had one since December of last year.
And is there one in the pipeline that just hasn't been confirmed?
There is one, but I defer to our the White House personnel system. And
do you know if there's one? I understand you defer for the specifics, but do you know if the person is waiting Senate confirmation?
Yeah, I'm not at liberty to say it's, again,
That's
this is a purview for the White House personnel.
Okay. You said that we are really looking at the case of the 2 murders.
Yes.
And so I wanted to know what that meant.
So
what are we doing?
We have an American citizen.
Mm-hmm. One was an American.
But that doesn't matter because both of them were they're investigating the mass atrocities that have taken place.
Right.
Their work is important to us. as part of the process, we coordinating, looking at investigations, pushing the United Nations, pushing operations, pushing the DRC, pushing.
Are they doing, who is doing the investigation, by the way? Is the DRC doing it, or is it international investigation?
We've said everyone is going to be participating in the investigation because this is a priority for the United States to look at who were involved in the murders and to hold those people accountable. One thing is that we supported the UN Secretary General's recent appointment of Robert Pettit of Canada to head a team that will assist in the national investigation into the death of Mr. Sharp and Ms. Catalan. And then we're looking at other means and methods to help those investigations.
Also on our end, I know that we were talking about the peacekeeping troops, but we pushed for a rather deep reduction in the troop levels.
Right.
So how does that work? Because I think you were saying, was that you, Ms. Anderson? Mm-hmm. Were you talking about the real need for troops, but yet we propose cutting them back?
Right. So the Ambassador Haley, in her trip to the DRC, one of the issues was focusing on peacekeeping missions that are fit for purpose, and I think that was the key word, fit for purpose. And so if we look at MONUSCO, it's probably one of the largest and longest serving peacekeeping operations for the United Nations. And so the issue comes in is, how do you make those more efficient, effective, targeted? On the one hand, yes, I know that Ambassador Haley had raised the issue of the Burundi refugees being killed by the FARC troops. How did MONUSCO respond or not respond? How about the intervention battalion, Tanzanian troops, et cetera, who are used to do it? It's not enough to target and to go after all the problems that are in.
I was just referencing that we asked for a reduction.
Yes.
But yet we said more were needed, so I didn't understand why we asked for a reduction.
Okay, so I think it's right now, currently is to assess the effectiveness of MONUSCO, looking at, do we have the right mission set and that it is fit for purpose, according to what Ambassador Haley
I see, so there might be fewer, but you're saying that it might be more specific.
Specific and targeted.
And you were mentioning, and I believe this was Ms. Anderson, was mentioning the electoral assistance that we've provided over the years. You gave quite a span of years, and I was just wondering what we are doing now, specifically, how much, and what does it mean that we provide electoral assistance?
I mentioned that we have been providing assistance since 2013 in preparation for this election that's coming up. So it's not just the one day of the election, but it's a process. And so our $37 million in funding is for those 5 components that I mentioned. And a lot of it has been in process because we have been working on things like voter and civic education, so that the people know what to expect, how to get involved in elections, working with political parties.
So just to understand kind of specifically, because I certainly understand that in the abstract, but specifically, do we fund a U.S. NGO or a DRC NGO that goes in villages and sits down and talks to people? Is that an example? And given that voter registration is real behind, are we doing anything? And if we are, specifically, if you can give an example of a project that we fund and what they do.
Sure. That's really important now because we have to keep adjusting. Now we have a date. So that means that we can put a number of things into motion towards the date of the election. But I can talk about, for example, the civic and voter education component of our program. This is, we've invested $19 million in this program. It's implemented by Counterpart International, and they work with 38.
Is that a U.S. company?
Yeah, yes. It's working with 38 different Congolese civil society organizations. And that's how we're helping to build a local capacity so that those organizations now, they inform the citizens. They work with the citizens to talk about the electoral process. What are your rights as a voter? What's your role as a voter? What do you need to do to get involved? And they also have a specific component on peaceful participation.
Is it a consulting firm?
Counterpart International is I think it's I may have to get back to you. It may be a not-for-profit organization. We have the 4 other components. I would like to mention the component on elections observation, and that is one of our few direct awards to a DRC-based organization. Which
is it NDI and IRI, or that comes out of another?
We have NDI
part.
is involved in the component of our assistance that we call political party training.
Mm-hmm.
So
and then you fund a DRC group to do the observation?
Right. So they coordinate a number of Congolese groups to do the observation. And this is the Episcopal Justice and Peace Organization in DRC.
So given that now we know the election is December of next year, is more money needed?
Now,
or because these elections have been stalled, have you been holding on to the dollars in anticipation that one day we get a date?
Yeah, we're hustling now to have a look at what we have, but we had extended our awards into 2018 and 2019. And at this point, I think we may have to make some adjustments to get us through the period of the elections. But for the most part, we had done extensions to the programs to allow us to continue into 2018, potentially 2019.
Thank you.
It's a long process, so it's not just the election.
Especially when you don't know when.
Yes, and then we hope that they stick to the date too. We have to hold them to that.
You know, as you realize unmet need, if you could advise our subcommittee, I know you'll be advising hopefully the Appropriations Committee as well, so that we can try to meet that need. Yield to my good friend and colleague, Dan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question for both of you. Maybe, Mr. Secretary, you could speak about the election process, and maybe Ms. Anders, you could talk about our humanitarian efforts. We are a passionate nation, particularly when it comes to both democracies and humanitarian efforts. We're also a very compassionate nation. How do we see our role, the United States' role, in the government of other countries? There's a lot of talk about other countries' influence on our election process here in the United States. Now we're talking about maybe the United States' involvement in elections in another country. I was just wondering, how do we define our role, or what do we see as proper? And for the humanitarian efforts in a country, I'm not sure that they're cooperative with USAID's efforts to help people, but we as a nation reach out to those folks in the rest of the globe who are suffering, and sometimes their countries or their government might not appreciate our efforts and may see what we're trying to do in a humanitarian environment as trying to influence their people in other ways. So I was just wondering if you could just give me some background on that.
So our role in the political process, we don't pick winners, losers. We're not addressing or advocating for any candidate. What we're doing is that these are agreements, the Constitution of the DRC and the St. Sylvester Agreement of 2016, negotiated by the Catholic Church, which both the government and the opposition signed. What we're doing is holding both parties accountable and committed to what they had signed. And for 4 years, I led peace talks and negotiations in the Congo, and everywhere I went, the United States stands as a symbol that we are going to work for what the people of Congo want, and they demand an election, a credible, free, fair, open election. And in that context, we're going to support the people of the Congo to say, yes, we're behind you. We're going to hold the government and the opposition accountable to do these electoral process in 2018.
And Mr. Secretary, do we do that as a nation? Are we doing that as a group, as the United Nations? How do we do it? Does the United States stand alone in doing that, or our partners at the UN assist in that as well?
Yes, we do that in the context of negotiations with the donor community, the United Nations, but also the African unions and also local communities within the Congo and also the various groups.
Mr. Secretary, Ms. Anderson, can you speak about our humanitarian efforts?
Yes, we always do our best to respond to humanitarian crises wherever they are. In the DRC, we have a very challenging environment. We work closely with the UN, with other bilateral and multilateral development partners, with international and local NGOs. We always have to coordinate our efforts. We always encourage the government, we need their cooperation, and we always encourage them to do increasingly more to respond to humanitarian crises. This is a tough one in the DRC. And I can say that we are a major donor in humanitarian assistance in sub-Saharan Africa, and that includes the DRC. So many of the other players look to us to play a leading role. And I would just conclude by saying that, once again, this is a very challenging environment, and it's very difficult for us to kind of get ahead of the situation, as well as to decide what to do, because it is a dangerous environment for our humanitarian work.
And when you say we're a great donor, is that just in financial resources? Is it in human resources? What is our actual presence there?
We have personnel on the ground who work on humanitarian assistance, and we work with local and other international organizations, especially the United Nations, to deliver humanitarian assistance in the form of food assistance, emergency health assistance, other types of relief supplies. And also one thing we work on is the protection of citizens, especially children in dangerous situations.
And my last question, then do you find resistance in the DRC from the efforts that you've just described?
I would say that one of the biggest challenges is the questionable will of the government to move forward on its commitments in the December 31st agreement, and also the fact that we have such a dangerous environment that with violence and human rights violations makes it very hard for us to do our humanitarian work.
I thank you both.
Chair recognizes a gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this important meeting. It's interesting, as a freshman member of this committee, to sort of do the learning curve on Africa in particular, and certain trends have emerged in my observations. But first, let me thank our panelists, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Yamamoto's service goes all the way back to oversight of the tragic events in Tiananmen Square, and Ms. Anderson served, and I will thank you for your service in the Peace Corps, putting a good face on America for the remainder of the world, and I think an investment that a lot of my colleagues undervalue as it relates to ROI and the opinion of America that people across the world who might otherwise only get that opinion from mass media have, and that's so important, so thank you for that. I don't want anybody to break out in laughter when I ask this question, but as we work towards hopefully free, fair, and transparent elections in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, what can we say we're doing to ensure that the Chinese influence over the electoral process doesn't tilt the scales in a direction that would be to the benefit of the Chinese? And that's an open question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman. We've looked at in our coordination with the international community, and we do hold annual discussions with the Chinese specifically on what they're doing in Africa. And we're trying to steer not only China, but all these countries to play a helpful, supportive role. The other area, too, that we have concerns is, of course, the exploitation of resources in eastern Congo.
That's my next question.
That is the area that we've been working on very long and hard, is that the people of the Congo need to benefit from the resources. There has to be a rational process in whereby you develop these resources. And one of the things is that looking at your question, is that we do discuss with the Chinese on a whole spectrum and aspect, and not just China, it's all the other countries that are involved, positively and negatively in the DRC.
Ms. Anderson, if you want to, and if you don't want to, then I'll keep going.
I guess I would just say, if you're referring to the elections and our involvement related to the Chinese, we're focusing on local capacity, and we're working so that the Congolese can be prepared to participate in their election and hold their own government accountable, and so that they can start to be able to define their own future. And that's the role that we're playing in the elections.
And that's
quite different from the Chinese.
Right, and so that's something that's noteworthy here, as we as Americans recognize that perhaps American, dare I say, overreach globally has manifested itself in ways that we didn't anticipate, that there are certain types of aid that are greatly appreciated and others that are taken because they're aid, but that come with a backlash, if you will. There's a vacuum, I think, inherently created, and the Chinese are all too happy to fill it. Pardon me, I'm going to do soliloquy for a second here. I've not spent a ton of time on the ground in Africa, but I did speak to a ranking member of a North African country wherein the entire presidential palace, that I would say probably rivals the Cannon House office building in square footage, was built by China. They built a palace. And when you get off the airport, and you served in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, which is a dynamic country where if we get it right, great things will happen, and if we don't, tragic things will happen. You almost feel like you're at a Chinese annex, and the Chinese record of exploitation of individuals is apparent even from 2007 in the DRC as it relates to exploitation of child labor, as it relates to the monopolization of the mineral deposits in DRC in particular, which, if properly levied, should make the DRC one of the most prosperous nations on the planet. The Chinese efforts are historically and demonstrably towards ensuring a Chinese access to things like tungsten and tantalum and coltan and cobalt that have manufacturing applications in anything from lithium-ion batteries to jet phone or jet engine components. And I get it, except what we're trying to do is empower the people in the DRC to be the leaders of the people in the DRC, and without a combative tone and understanding that there is a global economic struggle afoot, and the Chinese are extraordinarily strong competitors therein. How do we ensure the power in Congo goes to the Congolese, that our monies that are spent aren't converted by way of Chinese exploitation of stability that we help create to enrich the Chinese at the expense, literally, of the poorest and weakest people in places like the DRC? I'm asking for suggestions because I don't know the answer. Understanding that we don't want to take a combative stance, but that my primary function on this committee is, to the extent that it's relevant and possible for the United States to create a better circumstance for human rights, to do so. How do we do that without empowering the Chinese to continue exploitative practices?
I think that it's a very difficult question and a very complex situation. The issue is that we talk, it's not just the Chinese, but it's a lot of countries, outside countries. It's a lot of regional states as well that's exploiting those resources. And of course, our efforts is to ensure that we monitor, we hold people accountable, and we look at how these resources are being distributed and find mechanisms and ways that the people of the Congo can benefit from those resources. In our annual discussions, since your question is on China, is that we do have, we're coming up to another annual discussions with China to see where they can play a helpful role. In the past, they've done an engineering battalion in Sudan. They've done road construction to AID and U.S. projects. So looking and seeing where we can have areas of commonality and then areas where we do not, is how do we make sure that it's beneficial to the people in Africa.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, absolutely. My colleague from California, Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much. You know what, I look for, one of the things I wanted to say in terms of China's involvement, I really want to see more involvement from our companies, you know? And one of the areas that I'm really interested in is promoting our companies in the U.S. to get involved in infrastructure. China's famous for building roads in Africa, and it's a real mixed bag in terms of, what did you say?
Not so good roads.
Exactly, not so good roads. But, you know, we certainly know the quality of our companies. And so I would really like to work with you in the future in ways that we can establish partnerships to promote U.S. business involvement, because I'm distressed by the Chinese involvement as well, but I think one answer of it is to step up ours.
I think I would thank the Congresswoman and sort of pile on there. We've spoken just a couple of times, and I think originally with regard to oppressed minorities in Africa, and I look forward to working with the Congresswoman. It strikes me that the Chinese infrastructure created in Africa almost always heads from the natural resource to the ports. Go figure. But it is, at some level, a national security situation for our nation as it relates to rare earth minerals, et cetera. And again, there is a role for this country to play in perpetuating basic human dignities and freedoms and expectations. We could spend another entire hearing on alleged abuses by UN peacekeeping forces.
And we have. I say to my friend,
Right. I mean, it's
a real problem.
Well, it's tragic, right? To paraphrase President Reagan, I'm from the UN and I'm here to help, and it gets worse. And so that doesn't mean we should throw up our hands and stop trying, but when we have people of your caliber with your experience, you know, again, within the appropriate role and purview of the U.S. federal government, we need to care about human beings across the world. And a prominent foreign leader said to me, look, if the Chinese will help us and there are strings attached, it's still help. Yeah. And if we withdraw and create a vacuum, somebody's going to fill it. But the challenge here is how we are good stewards, work within the appropriate realm of what's federally allowable in this country, and then don't subsidize bad outcomes. And that's what frustrates me. And in no way, shape, or form am I in an adversarial tone from you two fine people. It's that I want to hear, we have these hearings, we talk, it feels good, but what are the answers? And so I think Congresswoman Bass and I are on the same page there, but there are opportunities to be had. If a corporate entity wants to make money, that's fine, but if they help people while they're doing it, it's even better. And so how do we do that? How do we invest? How do we ensure that our investments aren't undergirding those who are our geopolitical rivals economically and potentially militarily? And how do we do so without victimizing people who have a 200-year history of being victimized by outsiders?
Before we go to our next panel, just very briefly, I would point out to my good friend, and on one trip to Kinshasa, I'll never forget, I had dinner with, so did Greg, with a member of parliament who also has a farm. And he said, I can grow anything. And I really loved his attitude, and he showed me his farm. He could grow anything. I can't get it to market. There's no roads, there's no bridges, and I say that, no, there are very few. And the Chinese have come in, and in a quid pro quo, in a fleecing of DR Congo, which they've done elsewhere in Africa, they have gotten minerals, wood, all kinds of commodities at unbelievably discounted prices for those roads and bridges. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that precludes and holds to accountable those who engage in bribery and other corrupt practices. Chinese have no such law. So we know that corruption is a very serious issue here, and the Congolese are not getting anywhere near what they should be getting for what they give to China in exchange for those roads and bridges. So we need to do much more on trying to ensure that our, and I would say our friends and allies who are truly democracies with something like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act sell, but especially the United States. I do have one final question of many, but I'll just finish with this.
Mr. Chairman, if I can interrupt,
sure.
I apologize. And thank you for yielding. But the first thing we can do is tell the world that the Chinese are exploiting people. And again, I don't have a problem with Chinese corporate entities. I don't have a problem with them building the roads, but they are fleecing is a great word.
It is. And I'll say to my friend, we've had several hearings on that kind of corruption and that really exploitation of African resources on their way to Ghana. There's many, many countries. And unfortunately, it doesn't get covered by the press. We hold these hearings, we put in resolutions, we get bills passed, and it's not even on page 15. So that is very discouraging, but we got to do it anyway because we got to do what's right. But I thank my friend for raising that. My question would be, the UN 2017 humanitarian plan is now running for this year at about 42%. My question is, are the UN needs assessment, is it accurate? Do we have confidence that they have a real handle on what is needed to be done to mitigate disease, death, mortality from things like hunger and illnesses? And secondly, what does a near 60% underfunding of UN for the DRC mission humanitarian needs mean to women and children in vulnerable populations?
Mr. Chairman, we always have some involvement when the UN is doing their assessments because we're very engaged with them on a day-to-day basis. By the same token, we look at the assessments with a critical eye based on our knowledge of the situation and the ground. And the reality is that often the requirements are much higher than what we all together can meet. So it means that we always have to prioritize. And that's what we're constantly doing, is prioritizing and looking at what we can provide, what is the highest priority that's really going to make the most difference. The United States will always be there for people in need. Our resources are not unlimited, so it's very important for us to prioritize, and that's why it's important for us to have a good assessment of what the situation is on the ground.
I thank you. I would just point out that I've chaired hearings in the past, a number of them, about the mass exodus of people from the Middle East. And once they got to refugee camps, usually in the auspices of the UNHCR, they found there, once there, particularly longer stayers, that the gross underfunding, including the World Food Program, which massively cut their allocation, but it was order of magnitude about 40% of what the UN assessment was for those. And that's why they uprooted and left and flocked into Europe and elsewhere, because they saw no future. There was no education opportunities, and certainly there wasn't enough food, clothing, and shelter to meet their very legitimate needs. So, for the international community to go cheap on refugees and IDPs is a very bad bargain, first and foremost for the victims, but secondly because they're going to move somewhere else. They have to, because they care for their families. And I thank you again for your great leadership and for your testimony today.
Just one quick question, comment. So we agree with you, Mr. Chairman. It's excellent. I want to make one comment on what Congresswoman Bass had said. And the point is that I don't like to play defense, I like to play offense. And one of the offensive issues is that we need to get more American companies. And how do we encourage American companies? And the area, of course, is risk insurance and financing and other support. And our embassies are supporting 100%, and we're looking at means and mechanisms. So we're going to continue to do that, Madam Congressman.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now welcome our second panel, beginning first with Mvemba. Mvemba Dizolele, who is a writer and foreign policy analyst and independent journalist, a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. Mr. Dizolele was a grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and covered the 2006 historic elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. With the Pulitzer Center, he produced Congo's Bloody Coltan, a documentary report on the relationship between the Congo conflict and the scramble for mineral resources. He served as an election monitor with the Carter Center in Congo in 2006 and again in 2011. He was also embedded with the UN peacekeepers in Congo's district in South Kivu province as a reporter. He has testified before various subcommittees of both chambers, and again, we welcome him today. We'll then hear from Mr. Fred Bauma, who is with an organization known, the American acronym is, or name is the Struggle for Change. This nonviolent, nonpartisan civil society movement was founded in June of 2012 in Goma, the capital of North Kivu in DRC. The movement campaigns for social justice and accountability in the DRC and encourages Congolese citizens to push for the promotion and respect for human rights. Mr. Bauma was arrested in March of 2015, but was later released. He currently resides in the United States. We'll then hear from Séverine Otesser, who is a professor of political science specializing in international relations and African studies at Columbia University. She works on civil wars, peacekeeping, peace building, and humanitarian aid. Professor Otesser's latest research project examines successful international contributions to local and bottom-up peacekeeping, and peace building, I mean. Her earlier research projects focused on violence and international intervention in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where she traveled regularly since 2001. Her field work and analysis culminated in The Trouble with Congo, Local Violence and the Failure of International Peace Building, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. And then we'll hear from Ida Sawyer, who is the Central Africa Director for Human Rights Watch. She has been based in Congo since January of 2008, first in Goma since 2011, and in the capital of Kinshasa. In August 2016, Congolese authorities barred Ms. Sawyer from continuing her work in the country following a series of human rights publications, Human Rights Watch, on political repression. She is now based in Brussels, where she oversees Human Rights Watch's work in Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. Ms. Sawyer has conducted research across Congo and in areas of northern Congo and in neighboring countries afflicted by the Lord's Resistance Army, and her research has been integral to numerous human rights reports and has informed the world about what has been going on. If I could, Mr. Dizolele, if you could begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation and honor to testify before you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and the distinguished members. The views I expressed today are mine and mine alone. With your permission, sir, I would like to submit my remarks for the record. Over the years, I've proudly provided my analysis of development in Congo to several subcommittees in both chambers of this August Congress. Today, however, I beg for your indulgence. I do not wish to speak as an academic, journalist, analyst, or fellow. I want to speak as a human being talks to other human beings. I would love to speak plainly, no academic speak, no diplomatic jargon. In other words, what I want to say that Kabila must go. The responsibility for the suffering of the Congolese people rests with one man, Joseph Kabila, which he shares with a small and shrinking cadre of associate and family members. Over the last 16 years, this group has captured the state with total impunity at the expense of the people. A series of reports, including those from the Carter Center, the Panama Papers, the Lumumba Papers, the Paradise Papers, Bloomberg News, and the Congo Research Group, have documented and exposed the wide extent to which DRC's natural and financial resources, estimated in billions of dollars, have been diverted to benefit this small group. The Kabila regime has been characterized by three things: looting, plunder, and deadly violence. We have tolerated this for too long. It is time for a new leadership. Again, Kabila must go. Kabila's biography is a Cinderella story with a bloody twist. Kabila, having grown in outside Congo, showed up in Congo for the first time at the age of 26 during the war that eventually vanquished the late President Mobutu Sese Seko. When his father took over a year later, he made the son a two-star general and appointed him chief of staff of the armed forces, the ground forces, that is. 4 years later, after his father was assassinated, the younger Kabila became president. The Congolese disapproved, most of the Congolese at least, disapproved of the father-to-son succession, but the international community fully embraced him with total diplomatic, financial, and political support. Donors initiated a number of projects to help Kabila end the war that his father that he inherited from his father. This initiative included the Sun City Accord, the transition, the constitutional referendum, and the 2006 election. On the security front, the world raised the largest peacekeeping force or peacekeeping mission to help Kabila buy time and build an army. The World Bank remitted the debt at the tune of about $13 billion, again, to help him start a new economy. And then the World Bank also wrote a new mining code, but eventually Kabila will misuse that mining code to trade his power for financial and political gains. So we were really determined, the world that is, to make Kabila a success, and nothing could derail what he had started. We even arrested his main opponent, Jean-Pierre Bemba, to get him out of the way so that Kabila will succeed. Unfortunately, Kabila did not succeed. He himself set out to undermine the political gain and the democratic gain of the country. Despite the legitimacy that he had achieved, he wanted to change the constitution, eventually leading the country in 2011 in a highly contested and botched elections. So despite this goodwill, Kabila has not succeeded. Since then, the country has gone from crisis to crisis to crisis. When we confront Kabila and his associates about the abysmal record, they typically blame everyone and everything, from the weather, the political opposition, Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, the youths, the United States, and the militias. Everybody except themselves. Nobody ever takes responsibility for actions in DRC, and the government definitely never fires anyone, and nobody ever resigns. So even by the standards of Central Africa's dysfunctional states, the Kinshasa regime stands alone in its mediocrity. Unlike his peers in the region, Kabila has no political base and is so unpopular that he cannot face his fellow citizens and explain why he should stay in power. Every time he has made an attempt to stay longer, he has faced stiff resistance from the population. So his government has decided to simply not fund and organize the elections. His action has only emboldened the Congolese to demand that he leaves office. So I believe that we should not be, as the government seems to propose today, blissfully naive about the decision that we will be holding the election next year by December. A record stands for itself. It's been 16 years. I don't have to go further into this. But I just want to say that internally, Kabila has no good options. He's tried everything: subvert the constitution, kill protesters, jail everyone. The international community has helped him. He has failed. The only option that he has is to rely on military force and bloody repression. We've already seen too much of that. So at this point, in fact, the Congolese see him as an illegal, illegitimate, and unconstitutional president, which he is. They are already referring to him as the former president. So should we. Outside DRC, Kabila and his associates are spending lots of money to launder his image and fend off the pressure. They've hired mere security and communication systems, an Israeli firm to represent the interests in Washington, D.C. for nearly $6 million. This is in a country where civil servants, nurses, and doctors are on strike because they're not being paid. Nurses and doctors, yet the government is spending over $6 million in lobbying effort. A year after Kabila's mandate expired, we've tried to give him another year. That's way, way too long that anybody who is sensible should accept. It is unacceptable. Kabila must go. The longer he stays in office, the greater the risk for violence and instability. For my recommendation, this body and the government of the United States should impose sanctions on Kabila and his family and his inner circle, We've been imposing sanctions on people who are totally irrelevant, generals, Minister of Information. That isn't going to work. Kabila is the obstacle. He should be held accountable. We've spoken to Kabila for a long time at the highest level of this government of the United States. President Obama, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Clinton, Senator Russ Feingold, Tom Perriello, they've all engaged Kabila in the nicest of ways that most tin-pot dictators would have wished for, and he's not adjusted. We should impose sanctions on Corneille Nangaa, the head of the Independent National Electoral Commission. His delaying tactics fuel the tensions and pose even a greater risk for stability. Many of you have met Corneille Nangaa. He's really convinced in his own bubble that what he's saying makes sense, but all of us know that what he says most of the time is incoherent and nonsensical. In fact, Corneille Nangaa has retained a lobby firm, Reset Public Assets, LLC, to represent him in Washington, D.C., for a monthly fee of $30,500 to represent him ahead of an electoral commission. The Madison Group, LLC, represents the Independent National Election Commission for a fee of $25,000. This is a red flag. The message here is that the Electoral Commission and its president care more about what the US government thinks or does, while showing utter contempt for the Congolese opinion. While they almost never meet the Congolese opposition to update them on the electoral process, they're spending millions of taxpayer dollars, both in the US and in Congo, on frequent travels and on expensive lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. This, again, is unacceptable. Corneille Nangaa should be held accountable. He should be put on a sanction list. The US Congress, this august body, has been holding hearings for DRC for years to little effect on the ground. I feel that we are all accomplices, and unless we act, these hearings will remain but abstract academic discussions. Your committee, your subcommittee, have been considering a legislation on DRC for 6 months. Now is the time to show resolve and roll out that legislation forcefully and much more stronger. I think I will stop here and wait for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was reading your bio, and I think that you probably speak more languages than the rest of the room combined, which is unusual for a Marine. I was an Army guy, so thank you. Without objection, the full remarks of all witnesses will be entered into the record without request, but I thank you for that. And we have votes coming up relatively quickly, but I want to get everyone's testimony in if we can. So I would ask you all to continue, and Mr. Bauma, we'd welcome your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bess, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak about my country, the DRC. I hope to share some insights that you will find valuable. On Monday, October 30th, Jonathan Kasigwa, Gustave Kambale, Jean-Louis Kikandi, and Remy Mulwana, and Obed Mumbere, all under 20 years old of age, were shot by Congolese National Police and the military police while demonstrating peacefully in Goma. Those demonstrations were called by the civil society coalition, including movement Lucha. The aim of these demonstrations was to call President Kabila to resign as a consequence for his failure to organize the election and to respect the timelines in our constitution. It should concern the United States that this violent crackdown on peaceful protesters took place so blatantly within a week after Ambassador Nikki Haley visited the DRC. Violent repression of demonstrators calling for timely, free, and fair elections have escalated as Kabila willing to show contempt of our constitutionally mandated term limit has become increasingly obvious. I have personally experienced this repression, and when I spent over 17 months in jail for exercising my basic constitutional rights. But my story, unfortunately, is not unique. Since September 2016, almost 150 peaceful demonstrators have been killed, while 100 more have been arrested or kidnapped by security forces, and many of them remain in jail. Government officials, including mayors and head of police in some cities, has been recruiting gangs, ironically called anti-gang or some other name like Banamura. Those groups are deployed to harass and sometimes arbitrarily arrest civil society activists and members of the opposition. These groups have been responsible for severe human rights violations in many places in DRC and work tightly with the national police and the Congolese intelligence service. At the same time, journalists are harassed and media outlets are shut down. According to a new report by Journalistes en Danger, an independent watchdog, the Congolese government and the security forces are responsible for over 83% of attacks against the media over last year. Even while facing repression, Congolese people are repeatedly demonstrated with the same message: the need for a peaceful transition by the end of this year, as stipulated by the Senko agreement. As Vemba said, Kabila must go. The political repression is an only small part of the overall human rights and humanitarian crisis that affect millions of Congolese people. Over 4.5 million of internal displacement persons, including 1.5 million in only Kasai region alone, wherein international agencies have documented more than 30,000 refugees to Angola, 80 mass graves, and over 5,000 civilians killed and hundreds of schools destroyed. In the east of Congo, the region of Beni, Bukavu, Uvira, Tanganyika, and Ituri have been the theater of the surge in massacres and intercommunal violence. This grim situation is tightly linked to the political crisis originated by Kabila's unwillingness to organize election and his attempt to overstay his power in violation of both Constitution and the Senko-sponsored agreement. This agreement granted the government 1 additional year to organize election and create conditions for peaceful transition of power. The political uncertainty is causing trouble that potentially may undermine the peace and security in not only DRC, but also the region. While poverty and misery are increasing significantly and the country is collapsing, and the economy of the country is collapsing, President Kabila, his family, and his inner circle are known to have built a rich empire through illicit means. According to reports of different organizations, including the Congo Research Group, Enough Projects, Global Witness, the Central Carter, and more recently the Paradise Paper, Joseph Kabila, his family, and both his civilian and military entourage are involved in massive looting of natural resources, corruption, money laundering, potentially implicated terrorist groups. These activities include some individuals and companies linked to US citizens and the US financial system that the US Treasury could target. By refusing to respect the Constitution, by choosing to oppress and dismantle the opposition political parties, instead of implementing in good faith the Senko agreement, Joseph Kabila has undermined the trust and the credibility necessary for any dialogue. Full play on the part of President Kabila is so blatant that it will be a total waste of time to push yet for another round of negotiation between Kabila and his opposition. The routine of endless and now useless dialogues can no longer be considered as the only path to sustainable solution on the Congo crisis. Further, this government has demonstrated again and again that the electoral calendars are a delayed tactic, an empty promise used to divert attention for the fact that the government has no intention to organize the election that will remove Kabila from power. This delay tactic is the best way to ensure that the election will not be held, and that if and when they are, they will be rushed in the manner that they will neither be free or fair. This is a dangerous path for Congo, and one that I hope the U.S. also want to avoid. The only sustainable solution lies in the immediate resignation of Kabila from the office and his replacement by a respected civilian or team that will organize the election. We, the people of DRC, are not seeking for pity or charity from the US. We are seeking your support in our effort to prevent DRC from falling once again under a dictatorship. We are prepared to oppose by all peaceful means to a president who has violated rule of law as defined by our Constitution. There are steps that the US government can take to push for election and democratic transition with a peaceful transfer of power. The US should impose direct targeted sanctions against Kabila and his inner circle responsible for human rights violation, money laundering, corruption, and sabotage of the political and electoral process. The US should require the UN and the MONUSCO to stop any kind of support to the Congolese security service, including the Congolese army and the police, who are the main perpetrators of human rights violations. Any unconditional support by MONUSCO to the army or the police is akin to support institutions responsible for massive atrocities and human rights violations. Instead, the US government should work with the UN Security Council to make MONUSCO mandate more effective and precise, allowing it to protect civilians from any form of danger, including the one from the governmental officials. The UN should start without any ambiguity that they will not back any electoral process that will not end in free and fair election, organized by a truly independent commission with a credible voter register and in an environment where all participants are free to organize and conduct campaigns and rallies and have access to media, including public media, and where civil society has a voice, where media and judiciary are free and independent. None of these criteria are met by the Congolese government, neither by the current CENI. Finally, the US and international partners, particularly African Union, should push Kabila to resign to allow the return to the Constitution and honor the Senko deal and vacate the office by the end of this year. Any contact with Kabila should aim to effecting his resignation so that to allow the return to constitutional order. Mr. Chairman and members of committee, I hope that this committee and the US citizen understand our hunger for peace, for democracy, for liberty, for dignity, and for happiness. I hope that you understand, as did the US founders, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to its ends, as it is the case in DRC, it's not only the most sacred right of the people to abolish it, it's our indispensable duty. Thank you.
Mr. Bowman, thank you so very much. We do have a vote on the floor, recorded vote on HR 2201, the Micro Offering Safe Harbor Act. We'll take a very, very brief recess, subject to the call of the chair, and then we'll reconvene our hearing. And I apologize for the delay.
No, it's okay. Water. No. So, do I
Hey. How are you?
Great, it's an honor to meet you.
It's very nice meeting you too. We'll keep an eye on everything.
The subcommittee, will resume its hearing. No hurry. And Ms. Bass will be coming back. She had a meeting she had to make, but she'll be returning very shortly for the hearing. And let me ask Dr. Tensar if she could provide her testimony. And is that the right pronunciation, Doctor? Tensar. Okay, thank you. Put on your microphone, please.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the subcommittee for organizing this hearing and for inviting me. My name is Séverine Autesser. I'm an author and researcher and a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. Over the past 2 years, activists, journalists, diplomats, politicians have focused mostly on the political crisis around general elections and on the struggle for power in Kinshasa. We're so preoccupied with the upcoming elections that we're diverting our attention away from the many other issues that are causing violence in Congo, and we're wasting the opportunity to tackle these other issues. Based on 18 years of research on peace building, including several years living and working in Congo, I believe, and I will show you in my statement, that there is a better way to help resolve the Congolese conflicts. Congress should revise its approach to the Congolese crisis by recognizing that there are many other causes of violence beyond the electoral political issue, and by acknowledging that democracy and peace do not always go together. The two most important measures Congress can take are to increase the United States support to local and bottom-up peace building, and to put local actors in the driver's seat. The delay in holding elections is only one among the many issues that fuel the ongoing violence in Congo. And importantly, local conflicts at the village or district level also fuel extensive violence. So to be clear, yes, national and international leaders regularly manipulate local armed groups, including for electoral purposes. But at the same time, local combatants use national and regional tensions as a way to pursue their own specific local goals. So for instance, in North and South Kivus, villagers regularly ally with national leaders and with foreign militias to get control over neighboring land. As a result, Congo needs bottom-up peace building in addition to the current top-down approach. And the words "in addition to" are very important. I'm not saying that we should replace the current Kinshasa-centered, election-focused strategies with local peace-building measures. Instead, what I am saying is that we should add local peace-building to the set of options that we currently use to resolve the Congolese conflicts. This means increasing the United States support, financial support, logistic support, and technical support to local peace building. We should also recognize that democracy and peace do not always go together. And in fact, the push toward rapid elections has fueled violence in many other war and post-war environments. So of course, President Kabila should go. And of course, Congolese people deserve elections and democracy. But in the short term, there may be a choice to make between the two goals of democracy and peace. And foreign activists and diplomats and foreign politicians should not be the ones to make this choice. Ordinary Congolese people should. And this leads to my last point. Local people have far more relevant knowledge, skills, capacity, contacts, and means to resolve their own predicaments than we usually believe, and more than provincial, national, or international actors will ever have. When you look at things that have actually worked in Congo, you see that certain local ordinary citizens have managed to create islands of peace, literal islands of peace in the Kivus. Others have decreased tensions in Ituri, and yet others, like Fred Boma, sitting next to me, have created a wide democratic movement at the grassroots. The usual international approach is to ignore this kind of local initiatives. Instead, we should support, fund, and protect these local initiatives so that we reinforce them. And I published a book on how to do that. The book is called Peaceland. To summarize it in just one sentence, we need to build on local expertise, and we need to involve in the design and plannings of international efforts, not only the elite based in Kinshasa, but also local leaders, intended beneficiaries, and ordinary citizens. So to wrap up, we can help Congo establish sustainable peace and functioning democracy. But to do that, we have to look beyond elections and also support the other peace-building priorities. We also have to build much more on the expertise and capacity of Congolese people, ordinary Congolese people, and to support bottom-up peace-building much more extensively. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. Ms. Sawyer.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify. I appreciate your ongoing and bipartisan interest in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As you know, President Kabila's constitutionally mandated two-term limit ended in December 2016. Yet he has used one contrivance after another to delay elections while plunging the country into a web of security, humanitarian, political, and economic crises that have had devastating consequences for the Congolese people and risk destabilizing the volatile sub-region. During U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley's recent visit to Congo, she pressed Kabila to hold elections before the end of 2018. Clearly in response, Congo's Electoral Commission, the CENI, published a new calendar setting December 23, 2018 as the date for presidential elections. The silver lining here is that the CENI's response shows the considerable influence the U.S. government continues to have in Kinshasa. Haley's visit and strong messaging signaled renewed high-level U.S. engagement on Congo. It showed Congolese government officials that not only does Congress continue to be seized by the political crisis in Congo, but that the Trump administration is also watching very closely. Yet at the same time, the message that elections only need to be held before the end of 2018 was seen by many Congolese as giving a free pass for Kabila to continue his delaying tactics and stay in power another year, despite his lack of constitutional legitimacy. Congolese officials have blatantly disregarded previous election calendars, while Kabila and his ruling coalition have largely ignored the main terms of the New Year's Eve agreement signed last year. Kabila should be stepping down by the end of this year. By unilaterally extending the time frame, the U.S. runs the risk of losing credibility among key actors in Congo. Yet, if the U.S. is willing and able to use its influence now to ensure fair elections that reflect the will of the Congolese people, it could rebuild any lost legitimacy. The question now is, how far will the U.S. go? Senior U.S. officials delivered messages similar to those of Ambassador Haley as the end of Kabila's two-term limit approached in 2016. When that deadline passed, U.S. officials pressed Kabila to organize elections by the end of 2017. Since then, Kabila instead entrenched his hold on power through corruption and repression. Congolese government and security force officers went so far as to implement a deliberate strategy of chaos through orchestrated violence, especially in the southern Kasai region, where up to 5,000 people have been killed since August 2016. Nearly 90 mass graves are scattered across the region. 600 schools have been attacked or destroyed, and 1.4 million people displaced from their homes, including 30,000 who fled to neighboring Angola. In March, 2 UN investigators, Michael J. Sharp, an American from Kansas, and Zaida Catalan, a Swedish and Chilean citizen, were killed while investigating violence in the region. Human Rights Watch investigations suggest government responsibility for the double murder. Predictably, government and CENI officials have cited the violence in the Kasais as one of the main excuses for why elections could not be held this year. Kabila's refusal to relinquish the presidency can partly be explained by the considerable fortune he and his family have amassed during his tenure and the millions of dollars in mining revenue that have gone missing. Such corruption has helped leave the government bereft of funds to meet the basic needs of an impoverished population. Hundreds of government employees went on strike in recent months, including hospital workers who hadn't been paid since 2016. This comes amid a national cholera epidemic and impending famine threatening millions of Congolese. Meanwhile, brutal repression has continued unabated, as Fred described. Security forces shot dead more than 170 people during protests in 2015 and 2016. Earlier this year, security forces killed 90 people in a crackdown against a political religious sect. During a protest in Goma just on October 30th, security forces killed 5 people, including an 11-year-old boy. Hundreds of opposition leaders, activists, and journalists have been jailed. In July, unidentified armed men shot and nearly killed a judge who refused to hand down a ruling against an opposition leader. These actions are very much at the heart of how Kabila and his coterie seek to overcome the political crisis, by using all available institutional authorities to squash, silence, and flat out eliminate any opposition to his efforts to hold on to power. More protests are planned in the coming days and weeks. Citizens' movements, human rights activists, and opposition leaders have denounced the new electoral calendar as a fantasy and shameful maneuver by Kabila to stay in power indefinitely. They've urged the Congolese people to mobilize. They've proposed a citizens' transition without Kabila, led by individuals who could not be candidates, to allow for the organization of credible elections. There is a real risk of increased violence in the coming months. As things now stand, the US, including Congress, cannot afford to take its eyes off Congo. There is too much at stake. First, Congress should hold the executive branch to account and make sure the administration is not being fooled by empty promises. Kabila has given no clear signals that he intends to leave power, while the repression, violence, and corruption have become so pervasive across institutions and security forces that it is nearly impossible to imagine credible, peaceful elections being organized with Kabila still president. While there is no easy path forward, a short citizens' transition without Kabila is probably the best way to ensure good elections. To get there, the US should work closely with regional and international partners to press Kabila to step down, ensure concerns about Kabila's physical security after he leaves office are addressed, and actively support consultations to determine the management of a post-Kabila transition. We also urge Congress and the US administration to support the following: expand targeted sanctions on Kabila's family members and close financial associates, including those involved in serious corruption, to quash peaceful dissent or otherwise maintain Kabila's rule. Previous sanctions against senior security force and government officials have had an impact and appear to have helped change behavior and affect the calculus of some top officials. Yet additional sanctions are needed to show Kabila himself that there are real consequences for the ongoing violence and election delays. Publicly denounce the repression, call for the immediate release of all political prisoners, and for all politically motivated charges against opposition leaders and activists to be dropped. And 3, continue support in this challenging environment for the UN peacekeeping mission. We also hope you will continue to press for an independent investigation into the murders of the UN experts Sharp and Catalan, and to help ensure that those most responsible are held to account. Efforts to date are far from adequate. A failure to do so would send the message that those responsible for such a heinous crime can escape justice, risking future lives not only in Congo, but across the world where US and the UN have deployed experts. The US has important influence in Congo and can help prevent more bloodshed, but time is running out. Strong, courageous positions and actions are needed to demonstrate that the US is on the side of the Congolese people and their aspiration for a democratic, rights-respecting, and accountable government. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much as well. Pardon me. Let me just ask a few opening questions. The imposition of sanctions now is something that you clearly have indicated, and of course, in his testimony as well. Dr. Dezolele made a very strong appeal. Matter of fact, the first recommendation is to impose sanctions on Joseph Kabila, his family, and his inner circle. I know that the administration is very, very serious about this course. They hope it doesn't come to it, but my sense from gleaning from your testimony, it should be done now. By way of background, I'm the author of the Belarus Democracy Act. I remember on this panel, I've been on this panel since the early 80s, when we voted on sanctions against South Africa, which I supported and strongly supported, because apartheid is an abomination, thankfully it's in a dust heap of history. There was always concern about the impact it would have on unintended victims who then would get hurt by those broad-based sanctions. When I did the Belarus Democracy Act of 2004, which became the template for the Magnitsky Act, The whole idea was to single out the bad actors, starting often with the president. In that case, it was Lukashenko, the president of that country, and his henchmen and people who were benefiting. And we put visa bans on them, and we also said, you can't do business here. And I was the House sponsor of the Magnitsky Act here, and it became an amendment, became law, and is a very useful tool. And I'm glad, that we have it, but a tool needs to be utilized. So the big question is not that if it will be done, and we have legislation I'm going to be introducing, joined by my good friend Karen Bass, that really admonishes the administration to do just that. Delay is denial. Unless we see very significant progress that this is really going to happen, it's going to happen. Hopefully it would have happened sooner. I think December 28th is unconscionably long. Wait another year, more than a year. I just want to ask all of you right up front if there's any downside to doing it right now. For example, Nikki Haley has said, and she told us yesterday, that there's, and it was said, we would not provide funding for the election if there were problems, if it was delayed again. And that perhaps could unwittingly incentivize Kabila to say, okay, I'm out of here. I'm going to stay president for life. Of course, the raft of sanctions from not just the U.S., but the EU and others would then come tumbling down upon him. At least that would be the hope. So I just want to make sure that we fully understand, the possible consequences. I think sanctions are needed. If you don't use them, it becomes something in the toolbox that dictators and people who want to be presidents for life turn around and say, no worry here. There's not going to be a sanction now or into the future. So I think they need to be used very prudently and very effectively. And again, as you said, Professor Desolele, you want it now. So if you could all speak to the positive and the negative on that. You've done a little bit in your testimony, and I appreciate it, but I think it would be good to get it very clear. Should these be done today? Yes, Professor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two things, really. I think now is the time of imposing these sanctions. In fact, they're long overdue. Sanctions should have been in place, or the threat of sanctions should have been in place in 2016, in January, because all the signs had been there. We're talking here about targeted sanction to one specific group of people. We're not saying that the entire country of DRC should be under embargo from the US. This has worked in the past. President Mobutu, in his last days, faced similar situations. So back then, the US led the charge, along with the Europeans. Sanctions were imposed on him. Mobutu had been a strategic partner of this country, had received the Legion of Merit, one of the highest honors the US can bestow on a military officer. But when the time came to let go, we did let go. We put sanction on him, on his asset, on his children. Children were studying overseas. One of his sons was studying in Canada. Canada followed suit, denied him visa. He could not go back to study. It was very effective in that way. His associate faced the same situation. Today, if we are blissfully naive to accept that Kabila will hold the elections in December of next year, then we've not learned anything of the last 16 years, and the joke is on us. By that I mean, Kabila only understands the language of force. His people have said so many times. They've said that we came through force. If you want us to live, we'll only live through force. One force is sanction. Again, it's just to target specifically them. The children go to school here. They've come to your offices with the expensive suits and expensive bags to tell you why they should stay, and most of the time that is not founded in any logic. So I think we should not be catering to them. In fact, one thing I want to say, the idea that if they do not act a certain way, the international community will not engage, that's music to their ear. Because that's exactly what they will, that's what the perfect scenario. Nobody gets involved, let me play the field the way I want. So we should avoid actually aligning ourselves behind that position. It's a very weak position from Kabila's perspective. Thank you very much, sir.
I would like to add something what Mr. Dizolele said. I think the problem of DRC is not only the group Kabila and all the kleptocratic system around him is not only seeking the power for the sake of power. I think it's the way for them to get rich, to get access to resources, and to use them in different ways. And I think the other thing is that the same resources are finally used to oppress and people. And the recent research shows that, for example, with Glencore, that they had paid over I think 750 million of dollars to the system, which could have been enough to organize election, even if the election is very expensive. So I think, as Mvemba said, that sanctions should be applied and should be applied now. And those sanctions, the fact is that the inner circle of Kabila is made of people who are, all of them are businessmen. They are the officials, the civilian people, his family, all of them are have very deep link in mineral resources or any kind of business. So I think the efficient way is not only to target them in the way of banning travels or something like that, but be able to touch their resources where they can really feel it. And if they can't stay in power, if they can stay in power, but without protecting their financial assets, I think the interest of staying in power will lose its sense. So I think that it's important to target them now, but more important to target them where it's really valued, where it's important to touch, not only general targets.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I'm going to add 2 points. The first one is that if sanctions are used, they should be really used as part of a much broader legislative programs. Sanctions may help. It's not 100% sure, but it may help, but clearly it won't be enough. So it should really go with support for peace building, for human rights, and for basically what Honorable Yamamoto was saying, the human rights and the political side of the organization of elections. The other point is that sanctions should not only be linked to the electoral issue or to the fact of whether or not those in power are going to leave power, but also to the broader problems, meaning that they should be linked to the respect for human rights and to an end of human rights violations and to an end to violence as well. This is really important.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully agree that targeted sanctions should be applied now. We should not wait any longer. The fact that a calendar was announced does not mean that we're necessarily having elections, and we've seen the repression, the violence, the massive human rights violations continue unabated with complete accountability. So a strong signal should be sent, and targeted sanctions is a very clear tool that you have available to send that signal. We've also seen how the targeted sanctions, which have already been applied, have had an impact. They've rattled the political class, the senior security force officers. These are individuals who travel regularly to Europe, to the United States. They do their shopping abroad, their medical appointments abroad. Many of them have homes overseas. Their children study in the US or Europe. They have bank accounts in US dollars. They are personally very affected by these targeted sanctions. And many of them, since the sanctions started, they're coming to us, to others, asking, what can they do to avoid being on the list, or if they've already been targeted, how can they get off the list? So it has an impact, but so far, Kabila's inner circle, his close family members, his financial associates, they haven't been affected. So I think now is the time to go further up and show Kabila himself that the consequences are real.
I appreciate that. I would just remind, and for the record, point out that the President has this authority. It's very clear and it's compelling. We reiterated in the bill that we're going to be reducing very shortly that the President of Executive Order 13413, as amended by Executive Order 13671, shall impose the sanctions described in Section C within 60 days of the date of enactment of this act against any high-level individuals responsible for undermining democratic processes and institutions in the DRC and the entities they own or control, including senior DRC government officials, their international commercial facilitators with offshore companies, and complicit family members and associates. It shall be also impose sanctions described in our bill, which we have yet to introduce, but we've got a draft now we're working on, described in subsection D, and it goes on from there. But we're going to be looking for bold and demonstrative. I mean, talk is cheap, particularly here in Washington. We got to make sure it's backed up by something that is more significant, like a sanction. And I can tell you, because I was just in Minsk for a parliamentary assembly of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I'm the co-chair of the Helsinki Commission. Lukashenko has released the political prisoners over the years, and there may be just one left, maybe two, we're not sure. But the point is, sanctions work, but they have to be applied. Let me ask a question, Ms. Sawyer, maybe start with you. I asked the previous panel, obviously the two distinguished witnesses from the administration, and spoke to the issue of the 3.8 million, and there may be other estimates, but ballpark, of internally displaced, which is a catastrophic event for Congo, anywhere in the world for DR Congo, but certainly 3.8 million displaced. They're refugees within their own borders, and that is a terrible, terrible situation. The acute food insecurity has reached 7.7 million. Again, there may be higher estimates for that, but that means hunger, famine, low birth weight babies, stunting, and a whole host of other deleterious effects on the most vulnerable women and children. You pointed out in your testimony, Ms. Sawyer, that in the Kasai region, 5,000 people have been killed since August 2016, and you point out the impact that has had in your testimony on schools. 600 schools have been attacked or destroyed, as you testified. 1.4 million displaced from their homes in this area, including 33,000 who fled to neighboring Angola, so they're obviously refugees. You make a very, very important point. Predictably, government officials have cited the violence in the Kasai as one of the main excuses for why elections were not held in 2017. Seemingly, and maybe you could speak to this, incentivizing the use of violence, to impose martial law, which means killing people in the streets. And so maybe you could speak to that. And that is a perverse outcome. Rather than get into the election, it's in the government's interest to do these kinds of things and others. Maybe you might want to speak to that.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we at Human Rights Watch, we have interviewed numerous security force officers in Congo who have told us about a deliberate strategy of chaos, so effectively orchestrating violence either by security forces or government-backed militias, instigating local-level conflicts to create more violence, and then with these horrific humanitarian consequences that we saw in the Kasais, and then later that's used as an excuse. We can't organize elections, we can't do voter registration in the Kasais because we're dealing with this terrorist threat from this militia group in this area. We see also in the east, there's a lot of government manipulation of armed groups there. In Kinshasa and Congo Central province in southwestern Congo, reports of manipulation of the Bundibudio Congo political religious sect, possibly to create new violence, repression, another excuse to delay elections. So it's, as you said, it's very perverse, and it's just another sign that we have not seen any signs of a real intention by the part of Kabila to organize elections and step down.
Would the other panelists want to speak to, as you coined it, the deliberate strategy of chaos fomented by the government? Yes, Professor.
Yes, in fact, Mr. Chairman, in fact, this is one of my greatest fears in terms of delaying till 2018. Because what happened in Kasai is obviously part of this larger strategy of chaos. If we were to wait until 2018, I'm willing to bet on my honor that we'll see more flashpoint and zones of conflict in the next three months. That might even be longer. We don't know where they're going to pop up, but they're most likely to happen. Going from crisis to crisis is one of the favorite pastimes of the Kabila regime. In fact, a good friend of mine who used to work in the system liked to say the boss is a specialist in rotten situations. In other words, they like this kind of situation. So waiting until 2018 poses serious risks for this. Thank you.
Thank
you. I think in terms of violence as a strategy, people like to focus on Kasai because, of course, over this year, Kasai was the main region where there was a lot of violence. But I think now there is other regions where violence is once again used as a strategy. So I feel like the focus on Kasai has at least make the government official feel like it's becoming it's becoming a lot of pressure on them. And now we see that in Beni, for example, the violence restarts again after almost 1 year of stability. We see that in Uvira, in South Kivu, without the help of MONUSCO, Uvira would have been under the control of some armed group. Some of them have worked with the government in the past. We see that in Tanganyika or in Ituri, the same thing is started again. So I think the strategy of violence works very well in DRC. And I will not be astonished to see that in January or in February or in April, another region, another Kasai is created somewhere, maybe in Bakongo or in Equateur, and be used as a reason to postpone the election once again. And I have to say that there will always be a reason that seems to be a good reason to postpone the election. Last year we had an agreement. Now we will have election at the end of the year. Everybody is okay. Today we have a calendar. We can have election next year. Next year we will have some other reason, and the US and other countries will say, well, we can support election for 2019. And unless we understand that all these are tactics for delayed election, we will never have election. We have to understand what Kabila and his government want really, and they will never organize the election that will end up removing him in power. They may organize violence and other kind of humanitarian crisis, but not election.
To emphasize something that Mr. Obama said, I think that it's really important to keep in mind that, yes, you have manipulation of violence and instigation of violence linked to the electoral issues, but a lot of the violence is also unrelated to electoral issues. You have regional tensions between Rwanda, Congo, Burundi, etc. You also have local conflicts over land, over traditional power, over who's going to be the highest ranked individual, family, ethnic group in a specific area. And this sometimes relates to the electoral issue, and sometimes it doesn't. So when we're thinking about ending the humanitarian crisis that you described and ending the violence, we have to focus, yes, on the electoral issue, but also on all of these other issues at the same time.
Let me ask Dr. Ortisar, you talked about the biggest takeaway from your own book, which I think was to bottom line it so well, I think is very helpful to the subcommittee. To build on local expertise. I think there is an underestimation, and I think you really have eloquently spoke to that, that local expertise is excluded by design or by just inability to appreciate what is available. Is USAID tapping into that local expertise? And secondly, and all of you might want to speak to this as well, the role of the faith community, the Catholic Church, not just in elections, but also in reconciliation and of course, the provision of humanitarian aid, which is an important, faith-based entities do provide very efficaciously food, clothing, and shelter and medicines. And I mean, I have been in countries all over the world. The secular groups do it great, but so does the faith-based. And they often really get an army of volunteers mobilized which is one of their assets. But if you could speak to that, and while you're answering it, the role of the church in the elections, which you might recall I asked of the earlier panel, in making sure that violence gets tamped down, hopefully eliminated, while they move towards a credible, free and fair election. Doc.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith. I think regarding USAID, they're doing better than they were doing 10 or 15 years ago in terms of tapping into local capacity, but it's still clearly not enough. The way USAID works is still, we're here in DC, and we know what's best for people we're trying to help. So we know what's best for people in Congo, in other parts of the world, and therefore we design programs here in DC. And then when we involve Congolese people, it's going to be only at the stage of implementation. So people on the ground in Congo will only have to do things that have been decided elsewhere.
On that point, is that because indigenous NGOs don't have the capacity to write those proposals, or the NGO community in general not including the locals in a way that makes them full partners?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's mostly because it's not only USAID, it's most non-governmental international organizations think that outsiders...
It's a systemic problem throughout the whole humanitarian response.
Exactly. We think that outsiders know better. And we think that outsiders have the answers, and the way to help is to build on outsiders' knowledge. Well, what I'm saying is that there is, look at who's sitting next to me. There is local capacity. There are people who have the knowledge, the expertise, and who could help design the international programs. It's just that the standard operating procedure is not to ask them. And it's to decide things by ourselves here in national capitals, and then go in the country and implement them on the ground. As to the role of the church, it's very difficult, I think, to talk about the Catholic Church in general in Congo, because to me, I've seen members of the Catholic Church, including bishops, very high-ranking members, actually fuel violence, have discourses that fuel violence, that are full of hatred against a specific community. I've seen that in Goma, I've seen that in Bukavu, I've seen that on one-on-one meetings with these people, and I've also met priests who are in a village in the middle of nowhere, and who are the main reason why you have peace in that village, or why you have some response to the humanitarian needs in that village. So we have to be very careful, I think, not to think about the Catholic Church as a whole, an entity, but really to think whether specific individuals within the Catholic Church are the kind of individuals we want to support, or whether they are the kind of people we should actually be staying clear of.
Well, on that point, and it has been my experience that the church plays a very decisive peacemaking role. If you have names of people who are doing something contrary to that, I would ask that you provide that to the committee. I remember going back to the very old days of El Salvador when there was a civil war with the Duarte government and the FMLN. I traveled down there frequently, and it was the Catholic Church that was doing the human rights work and the humanitarian work in a way that provided a bridge to two disparate groups that had nothing in common. Because that is a very serious charge if that's true. We work with a number of bishops and others throughout all of Africa who, in my experience, and Greg and I do meet with them every time we travel, and with pastors that they do provide. And that's just not Catholic. It's also the other wonderful faiths that are out there, Muslim and Christian alike, who are playing very positive roles. So any names you have, please provide that for us. Would others like to? Oh, sorry. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just want to nuance a couple points.
Sure.
The Congolese want a change. They want a couple things. One is to respect the rule of law. They did go to a referendum in 2005 to have this constitution. So they are not idealists to believe that once President Kabila leaves, everything will become a paradise on earth. But what they're really interested in is to respect the sacrifices of the people who fought for this change, so that the president steps down, let another Congolese, men or women, emerge and take it to the next level. All the problems that Dr. Otser has mentioned are part of an extension of the failed regime that is leading the country. So the hope is that as a new regime, a new leadership comes in, some of those key issues of provision of services, including security and health and education and others, will be addressed with the new leadership. So that's what people are fighting for. In that case, then the election becomes very critical. In other words, we'll never get there, even to start, if we're always going around and around. We wasted 16 years since the generation, the kids who were born when Mobutu fled are now at university. You know, Fred was 10 years old when Mobutu fled. 7, okay. So the young man here was 7 years old when Mobutu fled, and now he's speaking for his country, and we're still talking about the same thing. So this is the time that is very decisive to cut that Gordian knot, and that's the importance of having this transition become a reality as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
If you'd like.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Sherin said. At the beginning about the local capacities and the peace building. And one thing is that I think the way some expert or some experts come with their solution and the way they understand, for example, peace or stability is like the minimum level of it that Congolese people cannot accept. You know, like when for example, UN talk about peace, is like if we can live in the city with where we will not have some trouble within a week, it's good enough. And for people who have lived in a conflict, in a violence, for very long period, there is some low standard of peace that we will not accept anymore. And we are not looking for something minimal. We are looking for something that may be sustainable. And I think Congolese people, as everyone said, we have some solutions to our own problem. And I think it may be the best way may be to work on the solution that Congolese people are suggesting to their own problem. And instead of bringing some imported solution, that is, which is worked on in offices in DC, in USAID or other NGOs, and where local actors will just have the role to implement them as consultants or things like that. I think there is so many groups, small groups, maybe less known, who have very creative ways to address conflict, to mobilize communities, to organize communities in a region that need attention for USAID and other US-based group. And it's important to listen to them, to understand how they do, and to support them, instead of coming and give them what they should have done, while they are the one who knows what they want. And what Vemba said about election is just true. There is so many crises in DRC, but I think with time, and this is also related on what I say, the minimal that minimal peace that we will not accept anymore. The fact of saying, well, we have to make sure there is a kind of stable country, and then solve small problem and small problem, but the root causes seems to be related on the problem of leadership in the country. And I think the election is just one way to do it, but it's the first way to do it. And I think in terms of long-term process, the civic education, the process of creating another kind of citizen is the main point. I think the election should be understood that the point where we start to build a different country, a different system. And what, for us, Lucha, for example, we believe is that we will make all possible to have peaceful transition but we are sure that the process will take so long. The process of having the democracy and the country as we would like to see it will take so long, and we will continue to work on it and to make sure even the next president will be able to keep him, to hold him accountable, and the next one, and we will oppose to any other president who will do the same thing as Kabila. So the election is not like a panacea for us. But it's a key point. It is something which has to happen in order to allow us to see the future as we would like to see.
Let me ask, with regards to UN issues, your assessment of the UN peacekeeping deployment, MONUSCO, are their rules of engagement robust enough? Is the number of personnel deployed adequate, or is there a need for more? Nikki Haley made a very important point yesterday, Ambassador Haley yesterday, how important it is that women be much more included in those deployments, particularly since sexual violence is so rampant. And on the zero tolerance policy for trafficking, again, I've had 4 congressional hearings alone on DR Congo and previous terrible exploitations by peacekeepers of young children and women, which was just, I mean, we went there, we argued with them, went to Goma, as I said before, and right now we're thinking of putting together another trip to go back to DR Congo, hopefully by the end of this year, if not early next year, on a myriad of issues, starting with the elections. Your thoughts on those 3 things, and then second, if you don't mind jotting this down for your answer. I mentioned earlier about the assessment done by the UN for how much humanitarian aid is needed, that we're about 42% for 2017, which is paltry compared to the need. I did ask the administration and witnesses, do they have confidence in those assessments? And my sense is that they do. They may be a little bit high ball or low ball, who knows, but it's order of magnitude correct. What does that kind of 60% underfunding for at-risk people do to those vulnerable people? I mean, in terms of food security and the like. And finally, last Congress, I was the House sponsor of the Global Food Security Act, which was signed into law. And that legislation, largely drafted by Pierre Tozzi, sitting to my right, our general counsel, and Greg Simpkins, was an important focus on really making sure that the food insecurity systemic problem globally, especially in Africa, is addressed aggressively. It also put an emphasis on the first 1,000 days from conception to the 2nd birthday. Now, DR Congo has signed up to the UN program for the first 1,000 days, which is, in my opinion, the most transformative program ever put together. If you ensure that from the moment of conception to that 2nd birthday, both mother and child have food and supplementation, it mitigates maternal mortality and morbidity, and as well as child mortality and morbidity. Stunting goes away if it's properly applied, and things like neonatal deaths and the like, which is rampant throughout Africa, are lessened as well. Of particular point for me on one area, I've written 3 laws on combating the issue of autism in America, including the original, but also the most recent Autism Cares Act of 2012. One of the biggest takeaways from the NIH-funded projects, 3 peer-reviewed studies, finds that when a woman gets a folic acid in the first month of her pregnancy, the incidence of autism drops by 40%. That is absolutely radically revolutionary in terms of every woman of childbearing age should have folic acid to lessen this growing developmental disability pandemic that's consumed the world. In America, 1 out of every 68 individuals are on the spectrum for autism. In the world, it's very similar as far as we can tell, although the studies have not been as robust. But we think there's at least 70 million people in the world who are on the spectrum for autism. And in Africa, according to the World Health Organization, we're talking about tens of millions, quote unquote. So obviously a country of approximately 100 million people will have a huge numbers of autistic children suffering, parents, no early intervention, and all the other processes that help those children. Folic acid, first 1,000 days, is just one of a number of initiatives that could make all the difference in the world in the life of a child and of a mother. And again, maternal mortality, which I take a backseat to no one and trying to stop it every time we can. Obviously, we all know one of the greatest answers for that is to have a venue where the woman gets skilled birth attendants and access to safe blood, which is another issue. My own daughter-in-law, when she had one of our grandsons, had a very serious problem with hemorrhaging in a Princeton hospital. And they had to go to other hospitals to get enough blood at her blood type to ensure those situations become catastrophic in a twinkling of an eye and a snap of the finger. So safe blood and all of that is part of what our response would be. And I like what you said, Mr. Obama, that the problems preceding the election will continue after the election. Obviously, this is not a panacea. So I think your point is very well taken there. But again, the UN responses on those, I hope you jotted down some of those things so we can get a comprehensive answer. We've got to know, is the UN getting it right? Are we doing what we can do on all of these various issues? Okay, start from right to left.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would start by saying that UN peacekeepers in Congo do absolutely critical work protecting civilians, and their presence across the country has saved countless lives, and we can imagine how much worse it would be if MONUSCO was not present and if the peacekeepers weren't there to respond to threats, protect civilians, help displace people, help people go to the market safely. So their presence is absolutely critical, and there's nothing happening on the ground now to indicate that we should start cutting back MONUSCO or that their presence is no longer.
My suggestion would be to cut back, would be to make right size
exactly.
it. And again, on the rules of engagement, while you're answering.
Yes, so I think just wanted to start by saying that they're critical, but that said, I think they could do much more to make their presence more effective. Their rules of engagement, their mandate is very strong, but it's often not the same across the board how that's implemented, and different troop contributing countries will interpret their rules of engagement in a different way, and some are willing to be more robust than others to protect civilians and in how they interpret their mandate. And I think we have a difficult contradiction within the peacekeeping mandate in that they're there to protect civilians, but also support the Congolese government and security forces, and they're often conducting joint military operations with these forces or supporting them on their military operations against armed groups. But this is the most abusive force in the country that they're supporting. So that is often a contradiction. There is a strong human rights due diligence policy where UN peacekeepers are not supposed to be providing any support to Congolese army officers or soldiers who have serious human rights records. They should cut support if these abuses are taking place, but that's not applied as well across the board as it could be. So I think more can be done there. And regarding the political situation, the political crisis, I think much more could be done by MONUSCO peacekeepers to protect peaceful protesters and to deploy robustly alongside protesters. And that could be an important deterrent to Congolese security forces who have a tendency to fire on these peaceful protesters. In terms of the zero tolerance policy for trafficking and sexual exploitation and abuse, I think we've seen some improvements in recent years in trying to address these issues more quickly and more effectively, but there again, much more can be done. And a lot of that is also with the troop contributing countries. So back home, these troops need to be held accountable, and there often isn't follow-up, and the UN can do their investigation in Congo, but back in the capital from where these troops come from, there often isn't enough follow-up to ensure that they're actually held accountable in a court of law. So more could be done there. On the humanitarian aid and what the underfunding means for vulnerable people, the consequences are huge. You have hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes. That means that they're often not going to school. Children are out of school. They don't have the health care they need. They often don't have access to the food that they need, and that has all of the medical consequences, but then also it's a generation of kids who aren't getting an education. That makes them more vulnerable to being recruited into armed groups, and then you just see the cycles of violence and impunity and abuse continue. So it is critical that these humanitarian needs are addressed, and they're enormous. I'll leave the other questions to others.
If you could, just one final, on the UN civilian personnel, you mentioned the peacekeepers with zero tolerance. What's your sense on the UN civilian personnel sexually exploiting others?
I'd first just like to say that among the civilian personnel, that the Human Rights Office is doing absolutely critical work in Congo, the UN Human Rights team as part of the MONUSCO mission, and they're a strong office deployed across the country, and they're documenting abuses, publicly denouncing the abuses, meeting with authorities, pressing for change, and it's really, I would say, a model in Congo from one of the best UN human rights teams that are deployed around the world, and that's something that should continue. On their political offices, I think they could be doing more in terms of their good offices to press the government to abide by their commitments, to put more pressure on the authorities, but that role is critical and could be enhanced. For sexual exploitation and abuse by civilian peacekeepers, I don't have specific information on that, but I don't have information about particular concerns either.
Thank you. Doc?
Thank you so much. I'm going to second what Ida Sawyer said regarding the presence of United Nations peacekeepers, which is absolutely essential. In many villages in eastern Congo, the United Nations peacekeepers are the only people who are protecting the population from horrific human rights abuses by all kinds of armed groups. And so it's really, really important to keep them on site. Now, regarding whether the way they're working currently works, I think that there are two ways that they should revise the overall approach to make, the idea is not to get rid of the peacekeeping mission, but to make it more effective, as I understand that you wanted to do. The first thing is that currently they use what I call the top-down approach, meaning that they are trying to resolve the conflict and to build peace by working with the government, working with the elite in Kinshasa, working on high-level state reconstruction, and all of these very abstract things, which is important, but they're not focusing enough on supporting local bottom-up initiatives, the kind of initiatives that Fred Boma mentioned and that I mentioned as well. So I think that they should do much more to support local peace-building initiatives. And again, not arriving and saying, we're going to go in a village and we're going to resolve conflict in that village, because they have no legitimacy and no expertise to do that, but really support the local actors who know how to resolve their own problems. So that's the first thing, supporting local bottom-up peace-building. The second one is, again, to put local actors in the driver's seat, because the way the United Nations peacekeeping mission works is like what we were talking about with USAID. They decide at the UN headquarters, in New York, in Geneva, sometimes in Kinshasa, they decide how they're going to resolve the Congolese conflict, and then the decision trickles down, and by the time it reaches Congolese people, Congolese people are just implementing strategies that have been decided elsewhere. And the decision doesn't even include a lot of people who have extensive country knowledge, people who've been involved in Congolese affairs for 15, 20 years. There are very, very, very few in decision-making power. So we end up with strategies that are very well-meaning, but that don't really address the problems on the ground. So that's why I think that we should really revise this way of working and to build much more on the expertise, not only of local people, but also of people who know something about Congo and who already are within the United Nations system, but because of the way human resources work at the UN, they end up working in Timor-Leste or in Sudan or in another part of the world. So really building more on local capacity and on country expertise. On your question regarding the consequences of underfunding humanitarian aid, I have a couple of statistics in my written statement that I think really illustrate what that means. I think, so it's a United Nations statistics. It says that 77% of Congolese citizens live on less than $2 per day. Less than $2 per day. The life expectancy is less than 60 years. More than 42% of children under the age of 5 suffer from malnutrition. And less than 25% of Congolese people go further than primary school in their studies. So it really means that if there is a way to increase the funding to the humanitarian support in Congo and to the development support, that would be absolutely essential. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that humanitarian aid means addressing the consequences of the problems, and especially the consequences of the violence. So we should also prioritize peace building so that we finally address the causes of this enormous humanitarian crisis.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I agree with a lot of what has been said, the performance of the Human Rights Office, their presence being critical, but I also have a lot of issues. I think we need to reduce the UN mandate in scope and time. This is part of the entire problem we have. The expectations and priorities are now perverted. The entire social contract is perverted. People expect things of the UN as opposed to their own government. They expect the security to be delivered by foreign troops that are just trying to survive themselves. And this underscores the failure of the Kabila regime over the last. We've spent, the US has pulled in billions of dollars, literally, to support Congo. And if we continue to think of the UN as part of the salvation, then we're in deep trouble. We're going on 20 years of UN presence in Congo. And there is no military rising anywhere on the Congolese side.
Can I just ask you on that point, if you don't mind?
Yes, sir.
The interruption? Again, as those UN figures suggest, 42% of the kids underage suffer malnutrition. People are living on $2 a day, 77%. Many of us would always like to see aid as a bridge to the point of self-sufficiency, but the concern among many of us, certainly me, is pulling vulnerable people off life support. Your point is very well taken. This is what the government ought to be all about, and Kabila has failed miserably. But that said, how do you, on the interim, you know, almost like an ambulance coming to the rescue, an EMT, making sure that you get to the point of surviving and then to the point of hopefully flourishing. But, if, you know,
yes,
so your point is well taken.
Yeah.
I really, you know, I respect it, but I would be concerned that, you know, we got to get, there needs to be this bridge of humanitarian assistance.
Yes, so I believe that, Mr. Chairman, that the human rights branch of the UN should be fully funded and being made stronger because of the condition we are in. Specialized unit of the UN, UNICEF, food program, those are not MONUSCO programs. Those are specialized UN missions that are playing tremendous role in Congo, and they need more support. But that's different from looking at the UN as MONUSCO, so I think the nuances are very important. Because if we're talking about security, it's one thing in terms of armed security and others. If we're talking about human security, please, this is what you're referring to, people on life support and others, we need to buttress that. So our challenge is how do we buttress those programs, whether it's the integration of ladies, women who have been raped, the support they need, the follow-up, with the entire notion of having 17,000 troops that are serving as an extension of a failed system that is in Kinshasa, which, by the way, have received as much as it can get to build its own military to support it. That is undermining the entire emergence of the Congolese state. So something that we need to care. We should not conflate UN presence with MONUSCO, because that has become a problem as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Mvemba made a very good point on the difference between the MONUSCO and the other UN agencies which are doing great job, like OCHA or UNICEF. I would like to focus a little bit on MONUSCO. And I also think that in MONUSCO, the Human Rights Bureau of MONUSCO should receive a lot of funds to allow it to work properly, because I think they are doing really amazing job. But the rest of MONUSCO, although I have to recognize that the situation may have been worse if they weren't there, but there are many things that has to be questioned on how MONUSCO works. And I think there is a lot of, for example, there is a lot of unities in MONUSCO that, in my opinion, are not effective at all. Like we have, and if you have the opportunity to travel in Congo, and if you came in Goma or in Beni, it will be important to have the appreciation of people on how they see the MONUSCO and how they evaluate it. In some places in the region of Beni, there was a lot of killings not far from the MONUSCO camp. And in many circumstances, the MONUSCO, after a certain time, they can't go out. I don't know if it's the internal policy of MONUSCO, but although they have equipment, they have guns, and they have all means to protect civilians, they are, I don't know if it's the problem of their mandate, but I think they are ineffective. And especially some units, the Indian, the Pakistani, or the Nepalese unity, which are ineffective. I think it is very important, if MONUSCO is to be maintained, to rethink how it is composed, what kind of troop it is composed, and what kind of specific mandate they have. We can't accept to have 20,000 troops that will not react, and when people are killed or when people are beaten by the police, they are just there observing, taking note. I think this is not how we understand civilian protection. I think if someone has to be saved, a life has to be saved, is at the time, if the life of someone has to be saved, they have to react immediately, not write a report in order to protect the life of other people when they can protect life of people in the present time. I remember in 2013, I think, when Goma was about to fall in the M23, there is a lot of MONUSCO troops that say, well, we can assure you that Goma will not fall. And I was in Goma at that time, and I remember how they start changing how they were saying, and say, well, the primary responsibility of protecting the civilian is from the government, which is a little bit funny, because if MONUSCO is in DRC, it means that somehow the government wasn't able to play its role, because if the government was effective, we could not need MONUSCO. So I think the way MONUSCO is founded, what kind of troop MONUSCO, in MONUSCO have to be rethinked. And some countries should be courageous enough to send their troop in the MONUSCO. Because I think also the problem is that some countries which has maybe more effective troops don't send them in country like DRC. Maybe they have another priority, Iraq or some country like that. And the consequence is that we have a force which is ineffective. The other thing with MONUSCO, I think their relation with Congolese security forces, and I mentioned this in my testimony, I think that kind of support should be stopped, because it is unbelievable to see the police using the fuel of MONUSCO coming and arrest peaceful demonstration or beat peaceful demonstration with money, with resources given by MONUSCO. And I pointed this out many times with MONUSCO officials in DRC, and I think it's time to stop that kind of cooperation with MONUSCO and and Congolese security forces unless we want to agree openly that we are supporting human rights violations and mass atrocities via MONUSCO.
Thank you for that insight and for your opinion. I would just note for the record, and I think we speak so often of all of you are very well versed on what MONUSCO is, but for those who may not, MONUSCO is the UN Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC. It's the world's largest UN peacekeeping operation with about 17,900 uniformed personnel as of August 31st. And when you look at the size and the number of people living in the DR Congo, I mean, that is a little more than a division of military capacity. That's why I asked about whether or not sufficiently numbers of deployed people are there to meet the need. And since we are dealing with an escalating crisis, it's not diminishing. Like you, I think very fearful it's going to get far worse. And staging a growing peacekeeping deployment can't be done overnight. It does take time. So I would note for the record, too, that the UN Security Council Resolution 2348, which was done in 2017, tasks MONUSCO with two strategic priorities. One, protection of civilians. Two, support to the implementation of the December 31st, 2016 agreement and the electoral process. Before we conclude, is there anything else any of our distinguished witnesses would like to add? Well, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank your committee here, subcommittee, for your support, continuous interest in DRC. I think we've traveled a long way, but we've traveled deep into darkness and misery in terms of DRC. I think we have one more opportunity to end this misery for the people of DRC. The people of DRC have suffered enough. They've committed themselves to sacrifice themselves. We've seen this through various protests, various processes. If you tell DRC people tomorrow we're going to have a dialogue for peace, they will come. But they've also run out of strategic patience, to use a phrase that is fashionable these days. And we don't know. If we do not act, we might see a coup d'etat. We might see people take up weapons. So we should not lull ourselves into things that will be exactly the way we're thinking. It's very serious, and I think there's a cadre of people who are standing as obstacle to this. And again, I reiterate, I think Kabila must go. We need to consider seriously putting sanctions on his family and his associates. Corneille Nangaa is standing on the way of having election. We are not children. They should not be playing with us. They should not be playing with you. The future of the country is at stake. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And on those words, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.